All right, so what we got?
This is a housing hearing.
This is what we're going to talk about.
The Build Act.
Build Act.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good way to get some left-leaning witnesses to talk about how good the bill is. Is it? Yeah. It's a little toasty, but it might just be you because you're sweaty.
Well, I'm sweaty because of toasty.
Yeah.
I just assumed that we should. Wonder what that is. We should. Oh, CDC. There's all kinds of bad things. Oh, really? You don't get that control committee. You don't get it. Top three did football money. You just scared it. All right, I guess I'll try it. It's a fun thought. I don't recall it ever being like this last time. Somebody.
Comptroller might have changed.
Yeah, it's climate change.
Climate change here on the hearing.
Yeah, I'm all for climate change. And here it's like hearing room warming. They're trying to prove global warming.
The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Housing Stock in America, Assessing the Infrastructure Needs of America's Housing Stock. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. Today, this committee convenes for a hearing on addressing the infrastructure needs of America's housing stock. Congress must recognize that our nation's infrastructure extends beyond making investments in our roads, bridges, ports, and airports. It also includes our nation's affordable housing. We're in the midst of a housing affordability crisis. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, there's a shortage of more than 7.2 million rental housing units that are affordable and available to the lowest income families. In fact, no state in America has an adequate supply of affordable housing for the lowest income renters. For example, California has a deficit of over 1 million affordable and available units. Wisconsin has a deficit of nearly 140,000 units. Mississippi has a deficit of nearly 50,000 units. New York has a deficit of over 600,000 units. Rising rents and gentrification are part of this problem. For example, in my district, the city of Inglewood is experiencing economic development, which, while it offers many benefits for the community, has also resulted in higher rents and led to displacement of residents. Affordable housing must be a part of any solution, or long-time and often lower-income residents will lose their homes. Our public housing system, which houses 2.6 million Americans, is also in dire need of investment to repair kitchens, elevators, baths, doors, windows, and roofs. There's a public housing capital need backlog of $70 billion, and around 10,000 units are lost each year as a result of disinvestment. Neglecting our housing infrastructure hurts our economy. Studies have found that the lack of affordable housing hurts economic productivity and wages. For all of these reasons, I put forth a discussion draft that would make the investments we need in our housing infrastructure and critical jobs across the country. The bill contains $1 billion to fully fund the backlog of capital needs for the sections 515 and 514, that is rural housing stock. $5 billion to support mitigation efforts that can protect communities from future disasters and reduce post-disaster federal spending. $5 billion for the Housing Trust Fund to support the creation of hundreds of thousands of new units of housing that would be affordable to the lowest income households. $100 million to help low-income elderly households in rural areas age in place. And $1 billion for the Native American Housing Block Grant Program to address substandard housing conditions on tribal lands. $10 billion for CDBGs set aside to incentivize states and cities to eliminate impact fees and responsibly streamline the process for development of affordable housing. $70 billion to fully address the public housing capital backlog. We also need to consider ways to incentivize developers to reduce the energy cost of affordable housing and to create housing that accommodates generations of families living under one roof. And so this committee has already passed the Ending Homelessness Act to house the more than 500,000 persons experiencing homelessness, and is now turning its attention to addressing another aspect of the affordable housing crisis, the lack of housing infrastructure. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Thank you for holding this hearing on a very important subject, housing. First, I'm encouraged that, Madam Chair, you agree with committee Republicans that barriers to advancing and promoting affordable housing at the local level are important topics worthy of debate and consideration. That's included in this bill. In particular, we need to find solutions to assist and partner with local communities who struggle to address affordable housing, especially the supply and demand dynamics in local neighborhoods. A report which was the discussion by this committee in the last Congress found that up to 30% of the cost of developing and constructing affordable housing is attributed to outdated and sometimes unnecessary local regulations. On the other hand, Madam Chairwoman, this hearing is more than a discussion on how to incentivize local innovation to attract development of affordable housing for lower-income families. This legislation you've drafted as a subject of today's hearing raises serious concerns about the funding for public, assisted, rural, and Native American tribal affordable housing projects. There is no question that today's federally supported affordable housing stock has serious capital improvement needs. The last HUD study estimated at $21 billion, and today we'll hear that number could be as high as $70 billion. These are big costs representing big needs. But I would suggest that if we're to discuss a proposal to infuse $70 billion into public and assisted housing programs, then we need to hear really what should be happening for a 21st century modern model for government-funded and assisted housing. We shouldn't just be funding old models. We should be looking at the newest innovative models and the current models that actually work and get the most bang for the buck. Funding aside, public and rural assisted housing is struggling. And it's not just because of a lack of funding. Innovation, in particular, using private finance markets to design and influence programs that advance able-bodied working families to get back into the workforce are effective models in the community. We have work-capable adults that are on the sidelines. We need to give them the means, the mechanism, the opportunity to get back into the workforce and to find themselves in their own stable situation. We need a more holistic approach. That's what's working in communities and getting people back into a sustainable housing situation. We know some of the tools that can work. Move to Work, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, and really the most recent idea, thanks mainly to Congressman Duffy and Cleaver, is the Housing Choice Voucher Mobility Demonstration Act of 2018. So I'd also bring attention to work conducted by Harvard University economist Raj Chetty, who developed the Opportunity Atlas using data from the U.S. Census Bureau and the Internal Revenue Service. And here's what Dr. Chetty found. Quote, if a person moves out of a neighborhood with worse prospects to a neighborhood with better outlooks, that move increases the lifetime earnings for low-income children by an average of $200,000. So I'm interested in the Opportunity Atlas because it indicated that my neighboring community, Charlotte, North Carolina, which is really important for my region, ranked dead last out of 50 cities. I think that's problematic. So I hope that we can work together to use the models that do work, that we can focus on innovation. I'm happy to have a discussion not about throwing money at Depression-era programs that don't fit a modern setting and a modern situation and a modern economy, and make sure that we have the right federal investment for the best outcomes. And so with that, look forward to the panel and the questions today.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, for 1 minute.
I want to thank the chairwoman and ranking member for convening this important hearing on housing infrastructure. As the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, I'm honored to mark the 51st anniversary of the congressional passage of the Fair Housing Act during the month of April, which is National Fair Housing Month. President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act on April the 11th, 1968, 1 week after the assassination of Dr. King. The Fair Housing Act was a monumental step forward for the civil rights movement and pivotal to establishing equal opportunity in housing for all Americans. In a 2018 report from the Council on Large Public Housing Authorities, it estimated that completing the $25 billion backlog of public housing repairs would infuse $80 billion into local economies. And according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, in my Missouri congressional district, there are only 3 affordable homes for every 10 low-income renter household. So we are coming up short and must address this problem with the necessary investment at the federal, state, and local levels. And Madam Chair, I see my time has expired, so I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today, and look forward to parts of your draft that work with rural housing development, Section 514 and 515. Chairman Clay held a hearing on these issues last month, and I think this is a point of potential bipartisanship, and I look forward to working with you and Mr. Clay and Democrats. But I also think we have to say, do we just open up the checkbook and start spending money, to Mr. McHenry's point, or do we have a new vision for what programs will work for the 21st century? And how do we effectively spend taxpayers' money on really important programs for virtually all of our communities? As Mr. McHenry pointed out, we have to look at the cost of regulation, local, state, and federal regulation on the construction of housing. And I think we have to work as a committee and as a Congress to identify those costs and try to reduce those costs, as opposed to some of the proposals that have come from the left that would actually dramatically increase those costs. And I think that's a point of bipartisanship as well. And just one last note, I would say that if we're going to be effective in fixing the housing crisis we have in America, we have to make it bipartisan. And that means working on legislation, I think, from the starting point to get it through the Senate and get the president to sign it. And I look forward to working with the majority. I yield back.
Today, we welcome a distinguished panel of witnesses to discuss issues around the U.S. housing stock. Ms. Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Ms. Adrianne Todman, CEO of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, Mr. Stephen Lawson, Chairman of the Lawson Companies and representative from the National Association of Home Builders, Mr. Daryl Carter, Founder, Chairman, and CEO of Avantha Capital on behalf of the National Multifamily Housing Council and the National Apartment Association. Without objection, all of your written statements will be made part of the record. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. When there is 1 minute left, a yellow light will indicate that you should wrap up your testimony. Mrs. Yentel, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. On behalf of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, I commend Chairwoman Waters for your leadership on the Housing is Infrastructure Act of 2019. The investments proposed are badly needed and long overdue. Our country's affordable housing crisis has reached historic heights, most harming the lowest income people who earn less than the poverty line or 30% of area median incomes. Nationally, we have a shortage of over 7 million homes affordable and available to these lowest income people. In other words, there are fewer than 4 homes affordable and available to every 10 of the lowest income seniors, people with disabilities, or families with kids. No congressional district has an adequate supply of available rental homes affordable to its lowest income residents. As a result, nearly 8 million of the lowest income renter households pay more than half of their incomes towards housing, and over 500,000 people in our country have no homes at all. The private market cannot, on its own, meet the housing needs of the poorest renters. Without government intervention, decent and affordable homes cannot be reliably built, operated, and maintained at a price that the lowest income households can afford. Federal subsidies are necessary, but funding for such subsidies have been declining for decades. In addition to the tremendous need to produce homes affordable to the lowest income people, we must preserve our country's existing affordable housing infrastructure. Public housing, home to over 2.5 million low-income people, plays a critical role in addressing America's affordable housing needs. Congress has underfunded public housing for decades. Between 2000 and 2016, funding for public housing repairs was cut in half. With limited funding, public housing agencies are unable to make needed repairs to preserve these homes and these investments. Our country loses 10 to 15,000 public housing apartments annually to obsolescence or decay, and other units fall into deep disrepair. The funding needed to address capital repairs in public housing is estimated to exceed $50 billion today. An infrastructure spending package is an opportunity for Congress to respond. Like roads and bridges, affordable housing is a long-term asset that helps communities and families thrive. Investments in affordable homes increase economic mobility, strengthens communities, creates jobs, and lifts local economies. NLIHC strongly supports Chairwoman Waters' Housing as Infrastructure Act and its proposed investment of $5 billion to expand the National Housing Trust Fund, which would address the underlying cause of our affordable housing crisis, the severe shortage of homes affordable for the lowest income people. The Housing Trust Fund's first allocation of $170 million has allowed states to build or preserve 160 projects with over 1,900 Housing Trust Fund-assisted homes, housing our country's most vulnerable people, those previously experiencing homelessness, youth exiting foster care, survivors of domestic violence, people with disabilities, seniors, veterans, and others. Funding for this successful and necessary program should be expanded to no less than the $5 billion proposed by Chairwoman Waters. We strongly support the Chairwoman's proposal to invest $70 billion for the Public Housing Capital Fund. This investment could quickly be used to repair America's deteriorating public housing infrastructure by fixing leaky roofs, replacing outdated heating systems, and remediating mold to improve the health and living conditions for millions, while creating local jobs and protecting a key piece of America's affordable rental housing stock. And we strongly support the proposed $2 billion to address critical housing needs in rural and tribal areas that have some of the country's most severe housing needs. As infrastructure bills move forward in Congress, NLIHC will monitor and oppose proposals attempting to increase income levels targeted by existing subsidized housing programs or to create new programs to subsidize middle-income market-rate housing. Using scarce federal dollars on market-rate housing is misguided and wasteful. In most areas of the country, the private market meets these needs. Where it doesn't, the federal government's role should be to incentivize or require local communities to decrease regulatory and zoning barriers to private sector development. Chairwoman Waters' CDBG set-aside proposal is a good step towards creating effective incentives. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mrs. Yentel. Ms. Todman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony. Would you speak directly into the microphone? Make sure it's turned on.
Okay, very good.
Good.
My apologies. Good morning, Chairperson Waters and Ranking Member McHenry. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today about public housing and the importance of housing is infrastructure. Last year, NARA celebrated its 85th anniversary as a membership organization. Our members represent over 70% of the agencies that actually administer public housing, home, and CDBG across the country. America's public housing is an integral component of our nation's infrastructure. It is home to almost 1 million families, including more than 360,000 families with children and more than 315 senior households. We owe it to those families, the children, and the veterans, and our homeless individuals who need access to those units, and people who are struggling with housing affordability to preserve those units. One might say, how did we get here with public housing? Over the years, as the public housing program rules change, the rents of the families who lived in public housing could no longer sustain the operating costs of the units. Congress then authorized the provision of operating assistance, which also could not keep up with existing costs. Unfortunately, the funding needed to address the capital needs of this important housing portfolio has never truly been realized, and we are now bearing witness to the consequences of those decisions. The Capital Fund is provided annually to public housing agencies for the development, financing, and modernization of public housing developments. Housing authorities use this money to repair and improve their public housing sites, address deferred maintenance need, and replace obsolete utility systems. While we are extremely grateful for the increased appropriations that were made in 2018 and 2019, The current appropriations levels are just not keeping up with costs. Extrapolating from HUD's 2010 capital needs assessment, we join our sister association, FADA, in estimating that the capital needs backlog to be upwards of $70 billion. And this is even after considering contributions made by RAD and the Choice Program. We applaud the inclusion of $70 billion in any housing infrastructure bill for the public housing program. And public housing is not just infrastructure, it's also an economic engine. For every $1 that's spent on public housing, it produces an additional $2.12 in indirect economic activity. We would also recommend to this committee that it considers investments into the HOME program, which has created more than 1 million units of affordable housing and provided direct rental assistance to more than 356,000 families across the country. We encourage you to consider $5 billion investments into the HOME funding program. In order to prepare for the effects of disasters on our housing infrastructure, we need to have both a firm plan to ensure resilience as well as a path back for when our housing is damaged and destroyed. We are pleased to see that this proposed legislation acknowledges the role that natural disasters play in interrupting housing affordability in communities across the country. Investing in affordable housing, particularly the public housing portfolio, truly is an investment in people. And it is a cost-saving mechanism that prevents additional expenditures downstream. In fact, a 2016 study found that living in subsidized housing as a teen was positively associated with adult earnings. The research also found that subsidized housing was associated with reduced likelihood of incarceration. Another 2015 study found that older adults who were able to access housing after experiencing homelessness had lower rates of emergency hospital visits and reduced overnight hospitalization. And investing in people is what this conversation is really about. Without that investment, there is a generation of children who will not have stable housing and will not have the opportunity to be, or may have the opportunity to be, as Rosh Chetty has also said, the lost Einsteins in our country, folks who would have had an opportunity but for the stabilization. It is that part of our work that inspires housing professionals across the country to get out of bed every single day and go to work, even in the face of impossible decisions and choices they have to make to keep public housing stable. And it is that reason that this committee and this Congress should be compelled to look at not just public housing as part of infrastructure, but the entire affordable housing continuum across the country. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Todman. Mr. Lawson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Chairman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity today to testify on this very important subject. My name is Steve Lawson, and I'm chairman of the Lawson Companies. I am proud to say I'm a third-generation home builder and apartment developer from Virginia. Owning and renting a suitable home is increasingly out of financial reach for many Americans. NAHB strongly believes that increasing the inventory of new single-family and multifamily housing is key to improving housing affordability. Factors such as regulations, availability of lots, lack of skilled labor, costs of building materials, and financing account for the increased building costs and insufficient supply. One aspect that directly limits the ability to develop affordable housing is the financing of it. Construction financing is commonly misunderstood and propagates a pervasive misconception that builders prefer to develop luxury homes and rentals. However, as I cannot stress enough, that builders would gladly serve families at all income levels if they could simply make the numbers work. Developers must be able to demonstrate the projected revenues will be sufficient to cover the loans. Builders will be unable to secure financing to develop a project if the projected rents or sales prices are too low to cover the expenses. As a small business owner operating in a heavily regulated industry, I understand how difficult and often costly it is to comply with the myriad of government regulations. It is particularly noteworthy in an industry where margins are thin and consumer sensitivity to price fluctuation is so acute. Although regulatory reform will help with housing affordability, it's important to note that NAHB does not believe that all regulation is bad. There's a role for sensible regulation to protect health, safety, and fair housing rights. However, when it accounts for 24% of the cost of a single-family home or 32% of the cost of a multifamily project, affordability needs to be part of the larger discussion when discussing or updating regulations. Impact fees are an example of imposed costs that have a direct negative effect on housing affordability. Impact fees are imposed often upfront at the time of building permit as a price of admission for developments to be approved by local governments. These fees are typically dedicated to specific public use like sewer, water facilities, parks, roads, or schools. Impact fees affect affordable and market rate development alike. The premise of impact fees is that development, especially residential development, does not pay for its fair share of the burden imposed on the local government. However, NAHB's research shows this premise to be false. The impacts of building 100 rental apartments include $11.7 million in local income, $2.2 million in taxes for local governments, and 161 local jobs. Results show that new homes generate enough revenue for local governments to not only cover their current expenses, but to service and pay off all the debt incurred to invest in these public structures in 1 year. NAHB applauds Chairwoman Waters for starting this important discussion on the role that additional costs such as impact fees play in housing affordability. NAHB supports funding for important housing programs such as the Rural Housing Programs and the Housing Trust Fund. We applaud the innovative ideas to incentivize lowering of impact fees and streamlining of the development process in your legislation, the Housing is Infrastructure Act of 2019. We look forward to working with you to address the unmet demand for low-income rental housing. While regulatory reform will help us lower development costs, it is financially infeasible to construct new affordable rental units without a federal subsidy. And that bears repeating. It is financially infeasible to construct new affordable rental units without a subsidy. Thank you again, Chairwoman Waters, for the opportunity to testify. We appreciate you convening this very important hearing to explore strategies for removing barriers to affordable housing development. NAHB stands ready to work with you to achieve thoughtful and effective policies to expand the availability of affordable housing.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Mr. Carter, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good morning. Chairman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the National Multifamily Housing Council and the National Apartment Association on the apartment industry's infrastructure needs. I am the chairman and CEO of Avantha Capital, an apartment firm with $1.7 billion in assets under management. Avantha is somewhat unique in that we focus exclusively on affordable and workforce housing in low-income communities where renters have high cost barriers. More than half of our properties are located in communities of color. We applaud Chairwoman Waters for recognizing that housing must be a key component of any infrastructure initiative Congress and the administration undertake. Before I begin my testimony, I think it's important to understand the context within which the apartment industry is operating. As you know, the U.S. has a serious shortage of housing affordable to low and middle income households. That is in part because demand for rental housing is at historic levels. Since the mid-2000s, the number of rental households has increased by more than 7 million, the greatest renter wave in history. To meet that demand, we need to build 4.6 million new apartments by 2030. That translates into 328,000 new apartments every year, a mark that we have only hit twice since 1989. Our greatest need is in the low and middle income levels, which is all but impossible to develop without deep subsidies. America loses an estimated 100,000 units a year to obsolescence, conversions, or demolition. And the majority of those lost units are from the lower income housing stock, the very units we need the most while development costs continue to escalate. We need to look for new ways to better preserve existing units and to cut development costs for new construction. That's why housing must be considered a vital element of this nation's infrastructure. Infrastructure and housing are connected in important ways. As communities struggle with inadequate transportation, water, sewage, and other public systems, they are increasingly looking for ways to pass infrastructure improvement costs to developers by making project approvals contingent on infrastructure investments. This, of course, translates into higher rents for households. My written testimony includes a number of examples of how housing and infrastructure interact for NMHC and NAA members, but let me share one example from my firm. We acquire older apartment assets with older infrastructure. We make investments to mitigate life, safety, and sanitation matters. In one project, for example, we provided all new piping and fixtures to make water and sewer flow more efficient. Nevertheless, we continue to have sewer backups because the municipal trunk lines feeding the property are too small. In many cases, these systems are 50 to 100 years old. Investment in public infrastructure will also facilitate more affordable housing preservation. But that alone is not sufficient to address our affordable housing shortage. While apartment completions have increased in recent years, it is virtually impossible to develop and renovate units at the rent levels low and middle income households can afford. The cost to develop apartments has escalated dramatically in recent years. Land, material, labor costs have increased significantly, but so have regulatory barriers that raise the cost of housing. Research shows that 32% of multifamily development costs are attributable to local, state, and federal initiatives. Developers must contend with things like outdated zoning laws, unnecessary land use restrictions, and arbitrary permitting and parking requirements. On top of that, many localities impose impact and inspection fees, inclusionary zoning mandates, and rent control rules. Easing these regulatory and other policy obstacles is critical as policymakers explore solutions to close housing affordability and look for ways to make serious investments in our nation's infrastructure. Madam Chairwoman, we commend you for holding this hearing and for your work on the Housing is Infrastructure Act of 2019. Housing and infrastructure are both critical nationwide needs. Policymakers at every level of government have a role to play in removing obstacles to housing production, easing costs, and supporting an environment for providing apartment homes. The apartment industry is committed to providing high quality and attainable housing for all Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to address this to Mr. Lawson. Mr. Lawson, 60% of U.S. cities have more than 25,000 residents, and they impose impact fees, which are fees on housing developments to fund other infrastructure projects. Dwindling federal resources for infrastructure improvements have pushed state and local governments to turn to impact fees to raise revenue for this purpose. This shift is raising cost on home builders as well as new renters and home buyers, ultimately making houses less affordable. In California alone, impact fees average $23,455 for a single-family home and $19,558 for a multifamily unit, which is almost 3 times the national average. My bill aims to address these challenges by providing funds for cities to incentivize or eliminate impact fees and responsibly streamline the process for the development of affordable housing. What are your views on impact fees?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman Waters. My view is that, as you very, very well stated, that impact fees are high, getting higher, and not often used toward the things they're intended to be used for. We also operate at each one of our developments operates at what we call the margin of feasibility. So every dollar in additional fees that we pay reduces the number of households we can serve. Very simply stated, higher impact fees directly affect the number of units that we can build. It affects the feasibility of those units, especially at the lower income levels. Any effort that this committee can make or that Congress can make to lower those fees, those impact tap fees and other fees, very much appreciated in the industry. We also want to make sure that the incentive is done in a way such that the fees that are reduced for affordable units are not transferred to other units in the marketplace, therefore making the affordability problem worse for other renters and other buyers.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you another question about the departments of city governments, for example, who have the responsibility for reviewing the plans that are put before them for the development of housing, and how there seems to be a lot of flexibility in determining what other kinds of requests can be made of developers that cost them more money. For example, the moving of a pole, the this, that, or what are those experiences like?
It's a very frustrating experience for us on the ground, because often those requirements are not very specifically spelled out. And that's a process. In many cases, it's a process of negotiation with the local municipality. And they very rightly have their goals and the things they'd like to do for their community. However, one new community cannot bear the cost of 5 decades or more of neglect in public facilities.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the distinguished ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and thank you all for your testimony. I mean, this is a very important issue to my constituents and all of our constituents represented on this committee, and those that are not on the committee even. Mr. Carter, I want to go directly to your decision making. How many states are you invested in? Whoops.
We operate in 12 states.
12 states, okay.
Yes, sir.
So, but you've got to make decisions on which states to operate in.
Yes, sir.
I would guess that's in part the economy. Is that correct? How do you make that decision on which states to invest in?
Well, we invest in primarily states where there's job growth, where there's lots of demand for housing, and also where there are people moving into that area.
Okay. Now, the question of the local appetite to either enable you to fix up these properties and make them ready for folks to have safe housing. Walk me through that decision on a local zoning effort, regulatory effort, and how that goes into your decision making.
Well, we operate in about 50 different municipalities across the country, primarily on the two coasts. And very often, when we go into properties, particularly where we're acquiring and preserving an affordable property, working with that local government, I mean, we often will buy a tax credit property that may have project-based Section 8 over it, where we may have 6 different regulatory agreements on that particular property that we have to navigate 6 different public housing agencies. So, very often, our business, I spend a lot of time, a considerable amount of my time dealing with local agencies.
Okay, but that question of your experience with these agencies, that'll determine whether or not, on the margin, you'll invest in a project. Is
Yes.
that correct? Okay. So if you lighten that barrier for you to more affordably put your money at work, would you do more projects?
Yes, we would. And more importantly, I think the key part of it is that when people look at a company like ours where we have $1.7 billion of assets under management, we partner with institutional investors. And those institutional investors most of them are public pension funds. So when I look at investing in what we do, it's, I think of my sister who's a teacher in the state of Michigan. And, when we take on a specific property, we're looking at the risk of how long it takes to do and the riskiness of it. So, you have many public pension funds who, where they're dealing with affordability crisis themselves, but then in making the projects that we invest in more riskier when you have many of these local mandates, it creates risk for them on the other side.
So if you do like a quick back of the envelope for me. So you buy a small apartment complex, right? So give me a number of units. What would be a
Probably our average size is 150 apartments.
150. Okay, 150 units. Roughly speaking, what type of investment do you make per unit to get that up to your standards?
A range of $7,000 to $20,000 a unit.
$7,000 to $20,000.
Yes.
So $20,000 a unit is a serious investment.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Of private capital.
Private capital.
Yes, sir.
So what if you took that number and made it about $50,000? Would that speak to the deficiency of the unit, or would that speak more to the inefficiency of the dollars? If I told you we're going to spend $50,000 on a housing unit, a similar apartment complex, would you tell me I was making a bad investment, or do you think that would be a wise investment?
Well, it depends on what the situation was. If it's a really old and dilapidated situation, it may need that.
So the bill that we have here today will spend between $50,000 and $55,000 per public housing unit in America today. That would tell you that's about 25% of the median home value sold last year. That's an extraordinary amount of money, and that's why I want to talk about the efficiency of these dollars in this hearing. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Velasquez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and the ranking member, for holding this important hearing. I just would like to say that I understand what you are both saying, Mr. McHenry and Mr. Duffy, that we need to help create more affordable housing. We need to work with our partners at the local level. But the fact of the matter is that in my city, Mayor de Blasio and the city council have made numerous concessions and renegotiated labor contracts and zoning requirements, but that doesn't take away the reality that NYCHA still faces the largest backlog in the country, more than $36 billion, almost 3/4 of the entire nation's needs. So while you're right, we need to work with our state and local partners, that does not mean that we do not have a responsibility here. In fact, the state of public housing in our nation is a direct result of the federal disinvestment that have taken place in our nation for years. We need to put more money into Public Housing Capital Fund, the Section 8 program, and other affordable housing programs. So I look to work with both of them to make sure that we invest wisely. Ms. Yentel, when we discuss providing more federal funding for public housing, one of the main arguments we consistently hear from the other side of the aisle is that bureaucratic delays and mismanagement by public housing authorities makes investment in public housing an unwise use of taxpayers' money. However, the last time Congress included an infusion of funding for the Public Housing Capital Fund in 2009 as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a GAO analysis later confirmed that housing authorities use the funding in a timely and efficient manner. Can you explain the GAO's finding and why you believe including money for the capital fund as part of any infrastructure package will be wise and efficient use of the taxpayers' resources?
Yes, thank you for the question. So as you say very well, the public housing capital needs backlog has reached well over $50 billion. That's a direct result of decades of federal disinvestment in capital repair dollars by Congress. So between 2010 and 2016 alone, Congress cut funding for public housing capital repairs in half, and that was on top of prior decades of disinvestment as well. So today, the public housing capital needs are severe, and an investment in repairing public housing is badly needed. PHAs can spend money when they have it available to them, and they spend it efficiently and effectively. As you said, the last time we had an infusion of funding for public housing capital repairs was under ARA, and the GAO studied how PHAs were able to use those funds and found that the vast majority of them used them within the time limits that were set. NYCHA, in particular, does well with spending its capital expenditures. The last 4 capital expenditures it received, it spent well in advance of deadlines required by HUD.
Thank you. Ms. Yentel, a recent study produced by the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities showed that for 6 PHAs around the country, $4.5 billion in direct capital spending between FY 2013 and FY 2017 generated an estimated $7.6 billion in economic activity and supported 7,600 full-time jobs. Moreover, the $4 billion in capital funding provided by the American Recovery Act generated over $12.5 billion in economic activity. Can you explain how investing in public housing creates jobs and acts as an economic generator by leveraging public and private sector resources?
Yes, there are multiple studies that share statistics, as you just did, that show that if we were to spend $25 billion in repairing public housing, it would generate close to $80 billion in new money in local economies. And I think it's important, too, to note that funding for public housing repairs has an added benefit of providing not just jobs, but jobs for residents of public housing and other low-income residents in the community through the Section 8 program that requires that when communities receive funds from HUD, they give first preference for those jobs to public housing residents.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Carter, you started your investment firm in 2007 to take a kind of different approach to Section 8 and affordable housing. How does your firm lift up residents of distressed communities and go beyond just developing a brick and mortar building?
Thank you very much for that question, Mrs. Wagner. You know, we view that our investment strategy is holistic. We're not investing just in brick and mortar. For instance, you know, about half of our residents are Section 8, and of our Section 8 residents, about 95% work. And many of those are two-income families. They just happen to live in a very expensive place like Southern California and the like. And so what happens at many of our communities, particularly those that have kids, when the school bus pulls up, you have, you know, the property is, you know, all these kids. And what we do in a number of our communities where we have lots of kids, we do after-school programs that really provide a place for the kids to go that are safe afterwards. And we can afford to make this investment in things like that if, in fact, you know, I mean, we find that it lowers our operating costs and many other things. So we take a holistic approach to it.
That's a great model. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we passed in the last Congress in 2017, created the Opportunity Zone program. This tax benefit is designed to drive economic development and create jobs by encouraging long-term investments in economically distressed communities. The St. Louis region, where I'm from, has 40 designated opportunity zones, including some in Missouri's 2nd District. I'd like to submit this map, Madam Chairwoman, for the record.
Without objection, such is the order.
Earlier this year, you launched a fund to invest in one of the nation's more than 8,700 designated opportunity zones. How will the tax benefit help your firm continue its mission?
Well, we are very excited about opportunity zones because it really made projects that maybe were not financially feasible before that benefit feasible. We believe it adds about 4% of return, which allows us, I mean, we had invested 4% more in return.
Right.
We own about 15 communities today that are in opportunity zones. And so one of our strategy is to take a number of those communities and where they're already affordable and add more density, add more apartments there. You know, we have communities we have a community in Oakland which is real close to downtown Oakland, an opportunity zone that it stays at 100% occupancy, and we have a waiting list of 200 people. So it'd be great to add more units to a property like that.
That's fantastic. So you've seen real positive results as a result
Absolutely.
of standing up these opportunity zones based solely on the fact that we were able to pass and have signed into law the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Are there other multifamily firms planning to participate in the new opportunity zone program?
Many are, yes.
Many are.
And I do think this will help add more housing in places that we really need it.
Great, and we talked, I know, kind of at length about the local barriers, and I just want to clarify with you. It sounds to me like the barriers in terms of over-regulation and burdensome barriers, pardon me, are not at the federal level, they are at the municipal level and the city level. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Most of them are at the local level.
Thank you very much. In my limited time, I want to thank you, Ms. Yentel, and the National Low Income Housing Coalition for your support of the disaster relief legislation that Representative Green and I have joined hands on. We want to ensure that people who need money the most can get access to funding while safeguarding against fraud with the proper controls. Can you talk briefly about how codifying the CDBG-DR program would help grantees gain access to funding more efficiently?
Yes, and thank you, Congresswoman Wagner, for your leadership in that area. It's very important. The CDBG Disaster Recovery Grant Program is the largest source of funds that local communities receive for their housing recovery needs after disasters. But without codifying CDBG disaster recovery legislation, Congress, HUD, and communities rewrite rules after every disaster, which delays the funds from being put to use. And the legislation that you have put forward would ensure that those funds are directed towards those with the greatest needs and for the housing needs.
I thank you, Ms. Yentel. Anything else you'd like to submit for the record, I appreciate. I'm over my time, but I'm so grateful for Mr. Green and for the chairwoman joining us in this endeavor.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
One way to look at it is the rents are too damn high. The other way to look at it is the wages are too damn low. We in this room celebrate with the Fed that we have what they consider to be a very low unemployment rate. But until we see an acute labor shortage that leads to rapidly increasing wages, we're not going to solve not only the housing problem, but a host of other economic problems as well. Transit and density are related. Congress tends to fund a lot of transit and not ask a lot of questions about density and zoning. We need perhaps to involve ourselves. This is a national problem, and the most important decisions are made in zoning, and we don't play a role at all. My state government is beginning to play a role. Density without transit is gridlock, but transit without density is underutilization and operating losses for the transit system. We need density near subway stations, and we need subway stations near density. One One issue is just how much housing does each person need? We have a lot more square footage in this country per person than Europe or Japan, yet we're the one with the housing crisis. It is certainly patriotic to demand that every American have a much bigger home than any European or a resident of Japan. But I see square footage requirements per unit per person as leading to keeping working class units out of a community, another kind of exclusive zoning. Does anyone have an opinion on how many square feet need to be in a unit for a family of 4? I'm not seeing anybody jump in, so I'm going to ask you all to Mr. Lawson.
I think we can go to the occupancy, the standard occupancy requirements, and a 3-bedroom unit in that case would fit the bill. And
so we should keep the standards and the system the way it is.
I believe the market should dictate that. Actually, we build.
The market is dictating that I've got homeless people in every park in my district. So I'm not sure we want to leave things the way they are.
And I'm speaking, to clarify, I'm speaking to affordable tax credit units, not for sale. That's a different dynamic.
Ms. Todman?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I think that you raise a larger point, which is how do we look at the built environment in a very innovative way so we can maximize the availability of accessing affordable units. And I would go so far as to say if you look at creating technology as a way to look at how we can decrease affordable issues inside of building affordable.
The Japanese have been very innovative in the use of technology so that people can live well in a smaller space, and I would rather be living in a small Japanese unit than living in the park in Reseda or Canoga Park or Granada Hills or Sherman Oaks. Mr. Lawson, you mentioned the importance, and I'm going to blindside you with this question, so I'm going to ask you to give me an answer for the record, the importance of these impact fees. So you want lower impact fees. That takes money away from the city where you're building. I want you to explore with your organization lobbying our state governments so that the sales tax on everything that goes into a unit goes to the city where the unit is being built, not where the builder's headquarters is located, not where the warehouse store is located, but where it's being built. Because if you want a lower impacts fee from cities, you're going to have to backfill at least some of that. Now, that's not to solve the whole problem. We're probably talking hundreds of dollars of units, and you're talking thousands. But your testimony indicates that by every few $100s we reduce the cost of building a unit, we can get a few more families affordable. I do have a question for you to, one last question is, how do these impact fees affect affordable and market rate units? Are they different for a luxury building than for an affordable building?
I'll take that last question first. The impact fees are typically assessed on a per unit or per bedroom or per bathroom basis based on the load on the public facilities. And I can say in one jurisdiction where I built both low-income housing tax credit units and luxury townhome units, that for the tax credit units, I was paying about $11,000 per unit just for the right to break ground.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing. Making housing affordable is an objective I share with members of this committee. However, housing is truly not infrastructure like we consider roads and bridges, I don't believe. Housing has historically been provided by the private market and differs from roads and bridges where public provision has been relied upon because markets can't always provide the relief these facilities provide in an efficient way. Therefore, I think it's important to think about housing as a private good that we take a public interest in, that we make provisions for the market to make sure people have access to housing as a fundamental need. In the context of housing market supply, supply conditions are really important. If housing is restricted by unnecessary use regulations and other non-value added regulations, that raises the price of public housing, obviously. Then the price of all housing rises, not only for new housing, but for existing housing. When we drive up demand without addressing the costs of building housing, we may be actually making housing less affordable because we drive up the price across the board. That's why it was pointed out at our first Affordable Housing Committee hearing, the role of local land use regulations in restricting supply and driving up prices. I introduced, and with this committee's help, passed an amendment in committee to provide incentives for local communities to ease restrictions on land use to help increase the supply. I think the carrot's probably better than a stick. And one of the fundamental challenges that we face today, obviously, is creating affordable multifamily housing or apartments. Changing demographics seem to drive that need. While none of us would support development of any housing that is free of reasonable, prudent, and healthful building codes, we must ask ourselves, can we make housing affordable in a regulatory environment that pushes up cost to this extent? Costs stem from what many consider as excessive standards. For example, a survey respondent to the study conducted by the National Multifamily Housing Council and the National Association of Home Builders estimates that recent changes to the International Energy Conservation Code have the potential to drive up costs by much more than the savings in utility bills. And I hope we can all agree that this does not help those living in affordable housing at all. And Madam Chair, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter this survey into the record. As we move forward on affordable and fair housing, I hope members of the committee will join me in keeping a laser focus on opportunities to offer supply-side solutions that make housing truly affordable. First question is for Mr. Carter. And America's housing markets are changing just as our population is changing more broadly. For example, rentership has remained at historic highs since the financial crisis. Our millennials, the largest generation since the baby boomers, are entering the workforce and choosing a lifestyle and flexibility it affords over homeownership. How can we update and improve housing policy to reflect the needs of Americans now and in the future?
Well, thank you very much for that question. One very quick example that I think could move the needle and is low-hanging fruit. When I go to many of our communities, I go at night and just look at the parking. And we have a lot of empty spaces. And simply put, with ride sharing and other things and Uber, we don't have as many cars at our communities, and I think many of our parking requirements are outdated. And if I could take the land on some of my communities and add more apartments, it would be a great thing. But that's just one innovation which has changed with the change in driving.
Well, that was one of the suggestions offered at a hearing that the chair called on homelessness, requiring 2 parking places per homeless person. I mean, if they don't have a home, the odds are they don't have 2 cars. It's just common sense. According to Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies in 2015, more than 1 in 4 renter households, approximately 11.1 million, paid more than half of their income in rental housing. Please share with the committee your specific examples of the ways in which the federal government can update our policies to provide it better. I got 4 seconds left. Thank you.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Yentel and Todman, a question for you. I know you can't see me. These two are in front of me.
We can see you, Congressman.
All right. But the last comprehensive infrastructure spending package was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which acknowledged the importance of affordable housing as part of our national infrastructure and provided $4 billion to address public housing capital needs. I understand those funds generated an additional $12.5 billion in economic activity with such a successful president, the recent history in mind. Would you agree that investing in public housing should be a vital component of any future infrastructure spending package?
I couldn't agree more, Congressman, and that's the basis of my testimony today. I would also add to that housing authorities across the country, all 3,000 of them, not only spent that money quickly, but spent it well. And of the $4 billion, $3 billion was given out through formula, but the other $1 billion was given out for green retrofits and really just creating energy efficiency solutions for very low-income housing products. And they did a great job. The industry stood up. And that's why I feel very confident, having run a housing authority in the past myself, that this industry is prepared and ready for an infusion of dollars to really deal with the backlog of capital needs that they have.
Thank you, Ms. Yentel.
I agree, and would just add on that certainly affordable housing investments belong in an infrastructure spending package, just like roads and bridges. Our country's affordable housing infrastructure is a long-term asset that assists with families and communities in thriving. It creates jobs, it lifts local economies. So certainly investments in an infrastructure package should include our affordable housing infrastructure.
As a follow-up question, how do you think the RAD program works for public housing authorities? Have you seen any successes?
So I will say that over the past decades, because of the federal disinvestment, housing authorities had to rely on all the tools in a toolkit, and RAD became a recent tool in the toolkit. And I think we've reached over 110,000 units that have converted into the RAD program. And RAD is simply just converting the asset from one program inside of HUD to another program inside of HUD that creates not just some regulatory relief, but also creates the ability to leverage private funds to do the capital improvements that's needed. There have been a number of very successful RAD experience across the country. I'll lift up the El Paso Housing Authority and the Austin Housing Authority have done extraordinary jobs in terms of using RAD to improve the lives and the units that they owned.
I would just add to that RAD is an important innovation, and there are PHAs that are using it for its purpose and to their advantage in order to leverage private dollars to invest in the capital need repairs of public housing. But we should also note, one, that for many public housing units, RAD will not be feasible. The finances just don't work given the level of repairs that are necessary. And two, that often when we talk about private investments going into public housing repairs through the RAD program, they're not often actually private. There are other public resources like home dollars or CDBG dollars or low-income housing tax credit equity. And while it's good and important to be able to use those funds to repair public housing, those dollars could be used for their intended purposes of building new homes affordable for low and very low income people. So were we to instead invest in the capital repair dollars for public housing on its own, it would free up those resources to do what they were intended to, which is build to be additive, to be creating additional affordable housing units.
Thank you. And Mr. Carter or Lawson, any thoughts on RAD?
Well, one thought is that, RAD is administered through public housing authorities. And as a company, we deal with about 45 of them. And they're all different, and they all have various capabilities. And so that's one of the challenges with the fact that many of HUD's programs are administered through public housing authorities, and there's 4,000 of them, and they have varying levels of ability to execute.
Thank you. You're back.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukenmeyer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A recent study by the National Multifamily Housing Council and the National Association of Home Builders, which Mr. Lawson and Mr. Carter represent this morning, found that an average of 32% of multifamily development costs are attributable to complying with state, local, and federal regulation. And it's very concerning to me, and this morning I want to talk a little bit about some of the bank regulations that could be causing the ability of individuals to have access to funds and restricting their ability to those funds, what they may have. Mr. Lawson, you represent the National Home Builders Association. And back in December, we had, I was chairing of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, and we had a hearing, and a representative from your association appeared and testified, and I asked the question with regards to the cost of increased costs, and what kind of effect it would have on people with regards to access to credit. And he said, and we since have found that on your website is apparently for every $1,000 increase in the cost of a home loan, 100,000 people no longer have access to credit, and therefore have no ability to have a home, the American dream. And so I'm very concerned because with the FASB new rule and regulation called CECL that is causing home mortgage folks to assess the risk of their home mortgage portfolio and change the way they reserve, it's going to have a dramatic effect on homes being able to be built or purchased, which is going to have, especially a low and moderate income folks, is going to have a dramatic effect on those folks. And I've talked to the new director of FHFA, and he's trying to get us some numbers. So my question to you this morning, have you looked at CECL and the effect it may have on the totality of the home mortgage business across the country?
I can't say I can speak personally about the specifics of CECL, but what I will say is that obviously the mortgage business, the mortgage origination business has changed very dramatically over the last several years. In fact, many companies that have been stalwarts in that business simply decided to get out of the business. That decreases competition and will therefore raise costs, which cost to the consumer, meaning less affordability, less home building.
Mr. Carter, you represent the Multifamily Housing Council. Have you looked at CECL and what effect it may have on multifamily housing availability?
No, I have not. We have spent a little bit more time looking at, for instance, CRA, which certainly has an impact on our business because we have a number of investors that are banks that invest through CRA via the fact that it fits within their affordability requirements. And so, we'd like to see more modernization of that because some of the rules of CRA are outdated. The other thing is that we operate sort of proprietary equity funds that we have to register now with the SEC as a result of Dodd-Frank, which probably adds another 10% to our costs when we launch a new fund.
Have you done a number or study to show how much increased costs restrict the ability of people to finance or go out and build multifamily housing? Have you done any studies on that to see where the cost line is so that at a certain point people no longer can afford to build the multifamily housing? Mr. Lawson?
I can't say that we draw a line in the sand, but that's what we do every day as we are drawing lines based on the moving variables, the variables that go up and down every day. Interest rates are one of those costs and all of these other things, rents we can charge. So any movement there reduces, any upward movement reduces affordability.
Okay, Mr. Carter, you helped segue into my next question with regard to CRA. To me, it's concerning. The original intent is worthwhile, and it did a good job for a number of years. Now it's sort of become a little antiquated. It's kind of outdated with the way things are working today. Can you give me some ideas, because you've already started down that path, of things you'd like to see different with the modernization of CRA?
Well, many of the CRA regulations for banks are based on kind of the old branch banking system and assessment districts. And when you look, for instance, at internet banking, where it comes from anywhere, everywhere, we think one of the things which would be helpful would be to modernize and to focus on the activity of what gets invested as opposed to where.
Oh, interesting. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Lady. This is a very timely and very interesting hearing. But let me start with this. I want to ask each of you, how can we even begin to intelligently address this housing infrastructure needs, particularly as it affects the middle and lower income, when the Trump administration is proposing to zero out the budget of the one major instrument that we have to address this, which is the Community Development Block Grants Program. Now, if we don't put that on the table, and if we don't put pressure on this administration to cut it out, it's insane. All of us realize that this is at the core a financial problem. It's a money problem. And when you got Dr. Ben Carson, I respect him, but every time he comes before the committee, I ask him, why and how? Now, I'd like for each of you to give us your indication, particularly Ms. Todman and Mr. Lawson. This is a financial issue. This requires money. And here you got the Trump administration wanting to cut out and zero out $8.2 billion at this great need, when one of the fastest growing groups that need it are our veterans. How cruel can you be? So tell us, how can we intelligently deal with this? Does it upset you all the way it should?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I think that everybody here at the table will agree that the White House's proposal was less than ideal when it came to infusing funds into the affordable housing programs. Our members administer CDBG, Home, the Capital Fund, and we have been disappointed year after year to see that those programs have been zero funded, but we have been thrilled that this Congress has done the right thing and come back and seen where needs are at the local level, the national level, and we are hoping that that will happen again during 2020, and we're very excited about what happened in 18 and 19. I think that all things around this issue requires a sense of leadership. It requires leadership at every level. That's why we're excited to be here and see the chairperson creating a leadership space to have this conversation. And so while these proposals will come down and zero out important programs for localities, we look to this Congress to do the right thing.
All right. Mr. Lawson.
Yes, great question. NAHB, of course, opposes the zeroing out of the CDBG as well as the home. Those are important resources. They are not all the resources. We need more resources, obviously. While it's not under the jurisdiction of this committee, the low-income housing tax credit is probably the most fundamental resource for creating affordable housing. We certainly oppose that. It is a financial issue, and we should do everything in our power as an industry to preserve the funding. I think this issue is gaining a lot more traction and a lot more attention nationwide. I know it is locally in the areas that I work, so that's a positive sign.
Very good. Mr. Carter and Ms. Yentel?
Yes, if I could add on, thank you. We share your concern and your outrage over the proposed cuts that go much deeper and broader than eliminating CDBG. The administration would eliminate the National Housing Trust Fund, would eliminate public housing capital repair dollars at a time when there's such a substantial need. Like Ms. Todman, we are pleased that Congress has not only rejected those proposals, but actually increased spending by 10% for the first time in many, many years. This is an important first step, but we have a long way to go to make up for decades of disinvestment in these programs. And we are still under the very tight spending caps required under the Budget Control Act, which is why it's so important to look for opportunities outside the appropriations process to invest in affordable housing, like through an infrastructure spending package, through GSE reform, through other methods.
Ms. Carter.
The quick answer is we will invest private money if we can get more private money if we can get more obstacles reduced.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Appreciate that, Madam Chair, and welcome. And my family has had a long history in home building and construction. My family was one of the founding families of our local Home Builders Association. I still own our third-generation sand and gravel operation. A cousin owns our ready-mix concrete company, all small businesses. But we have had the opportunity to provide hundreds of dwellings, and we've looked at multifamily housing as well. And one of the concerns that we have had is working with local municipalities to try to keep those costs down. We have a real issue in West Michigan with workforce affordability and trying to make sure that we can provide quality opportunity for people to live in or rent. We battle this notion all the time. And back when I was selling real estate full-time, we had to battle one of our local cities who had a great idea, which was to do set-asides for affordable housing. The one lone housing development, though, in the city had a minimum lot size requirement of 100 by 150, 15,000 square feet. And houses, they wanted to then have affordable housing put on those, and it just wasn't functional. They also were making a proposal to put in retroactively, go back into rental units, to put in hard sprinkling, not even smoke detectors, sprinkling systems. And they had no concept about what this would actually cost or what it would do for rents, because it all looked great on paper. But there's a detachment to reality. And Mr. Lawson and Mr. Carter, I'm curious. I don't want to just curse the darkness. I do want to light a candle on this, and I'm curious if you can provide maybe some of those candles. What have some of those local businesses, or I'm sorry, local governmental agencies done to help affordability rather than hinder affordability?
The one thing I would point out that one of the issues that we've talked a lot about the cost of what those things add, but I think what we sometimes miss is the additional risk that the process makes for the project. The fact that particularly in California, which is my current home state, I grew up in your home state.
Right. I won't make you point to your hand where you're from.
Yeah, I was over here.
Okay, well, I'm over here, so.
But, you know, the problem in many municipalities across the country, particularly in California is one of them where we're based, is that it may take 3 to 10 years before you know the final zoning approval of what you're getting and whether you're going to have 200 units or 300 units. And you may, in that time period, spend $3 to $10 million of risk without knowing the economics of the project.
So just so we know, we can figure out the math. Does that make it cheaper if you can put 300 units in versus 200?
Yes.
Okay, let's just make sure, because we sometimes lose sight of that in Washington. And I think that goes back to my friend from California, Mr. Sherman, was talking about. You know, it's his phrase that was used, you know, the rent's too damn high. Well, sometimes the costs are too damn high, right? And how do you make sure that it's not just materials, it's the process, it's the development costs, it's that time value of money for anyone in the private sector that is going to do this. And we cannot just simply punt this over to the government at all the time. Mr. Lawson, I want to give you an opportunity to answer as well.
Yes,
light the candle.
I appreciate that, and you clearly feel our pain, so thank you for that. I think one of the discussions we had earlier about creating incentives for local municipalities to streamline the process or to make their zoning less exclusionary. One of the things in the industry that, or one of the things many municipalities have taken up is inclusionary zoning and mandatory inclusionary zoning. I oppose that. I think it should be voluntary. There should be an economic quid pro quo between that so that it doesn't simply become a tax on the market rate units in a community. And that would be density bonuses, fee waivers, all sorts of incentives can be created.
And this notion of mixed use is something that seems to be lost as well. And having the ability to have different incomes all in the same area, maybe not with the same lot size like my city back in the district was trying to do, but if you changed and varied the lot size, you could actually make it more affordable to have those families have that opportunity. So with that, I yield back.
Absolutely.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, Monetary Policy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was in my home state of Texas this past weekend. So I got up yesterday morning, drove 26 miles from the Renaissance downtown Dallas to the place where I was born, Waxhatchee. It's a little community, about 12,000. So I drove to my maternal grandmother's home, gone. Went to my grandma Gardner's home, gone. I went to my paternal grandfather's home, gone. And Edna's house, gone. Little town, all you see is just vacant land. And I couldn't help but wonder the same thing I wondered about Capitol Hill. I moved here 14 years ago on Capitol Hill, and it was a rather, homogeneous neighborhood. And now you have to hunt down black people. You have to, you go walk from my apartment right across the street from the Supreme Court to Eastern Market. And I had a little deal. I was trying to count black people as I walked. A couple of weeks ago, I saw 2. Nice sunny day. And I think about the new stadium. Human beings used to live down there. I wonder where all of those people are. I wonder where those people are in that little Waxhatchee. I wonder where these people are who used to live on Capitol Hill. All gone. I was in San Francisco this past year, August, staying with some friends, my wife and I, and we're driving around, and our host said the black-brown population in San Francisco has dropped now to about 2% because they can't afford to live there. So I asked Barbara Lee, I said, are they moving over into Oakland? She said, well, they were, but she said the price of homes now in Oakland are rising to the level they were in San Francisco, so they've left Oakland. And I said, well, did they go to Richmond? She said, we don't know where they're going. Have you guys ever wondered where they're going? I mean, you're in the home housing business. Can you tell me where they're going? Anybody?
Congressman, I think that's the value of this conversation today. That if you look at the public housing portfolio across the country, it's important to make sure that they are preserved for years to come. Otherwise, the people who live there, brown, black, otherwise, will also be gone because those units have not been preserved. But it also speaks to the importance of balancing market forces with the intervention of government to make smart choices for the community. And when we do that, we can see that there can be certain tactics that are put in play to preserve not just the small businesses that were there during the difficult times, but should be there during the robust times, but also for families who live in unsubsidized housing, what's called naturally occurring affordable housing, to be able to stay in communities as well. I believe, I'm a strong believer in what market forces can do, but I also believe it takes leadership inside of the public policy space to make sure that what you're describing doesn't continue to be an issue throughout the country.
Yeah, it's a major issue. Let me get this out so I can make sure I get it said. And that is, it's not just the urban areas. I don't think people realize, because it's a little more convenient to believe it's an urban problem. It's worse in the rural areas. I've been working on a housing project in a little town called Marshall, Missouri, now for 3 years. Very, very difficult. They said they can't. The builders say they can't build a housing. This is the Midwest for under $125,000. So that we virtually at a standstill. But the new problem that just cropped up that you may or may not be aware of, and that is the tariffs. The tariffs that were imposed on countries like China, they're hurting in housing because the price of everything is rising. They closed down a nail factory in my state. So anything from nails to granite countertops, the price is rising. And so we had a dramatic drop in new housing starts in March. Affordable housing just stopped because the cost is rising so high. Anyway, take it from there, Mr. Lawson.
Well, that's the eternal challenge for us as practitioners in every aspect of affordable housing, home building, anything. We're constantly assessing our costs and fighting against that, trying to find new resources. Hence, I think the discussion today, if we could find a reasonable way to lower.
National emergency. It's a national emergency.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think what's unique about this hearing is that we agree we have a problem. A problem exists with affordable housing in America. And now the question becomes, how do we find the right solutions to address that problem? And I don't know that I would agree that a blank check approach is the only approach we could have to making sure housing works for our families and our communities. And with Mr. Cleaver, I would agree there's different problems in different parts of the country. And in inner cities and rural America, I think we have different and unique problems that face those kind of communities, and all should be addressed. But I want to go to maybe Mr. Carter. You said you do some of your work in Southern California?
Yes, sir.
Could you lay out for us some of the challenges that you face with zoning and regulation as you try to do projects in Southern California?
Well, I think the first one is density. How big will it be? And that's because that obviously drives the economics of the project, is density. And I think second is...
What do you say density is? When you're trying to get approvals, is that a problem, the density of your project?
Yes, whether it's 200 units or 150 units. Obviously, the more density, we can make it cheaper per unit. And then the pushback is, well, you're going to add more people, and there's more mitigation that you have to do with roads and things like that. So it's a back and forth process.
But finding that sweet spot of getting the right density to get the right price for the most people is an important consideration for you.
Yes, sir.
Right? And maybe to stick on that point before you maybe lay out some other things for us. Obviously, we have a crisis in Southern California, and specifically in LA. The chair has talked about this. There's a homelessness problem in LA that we have to address, and I've heard her on that point, and she's a great advocate for the homeless. But if we could make housing more affordable, that could potentially reduce the number of people who can't afford homes and are on the streets. And so does those leaders in LA partner with you and clear the way and cut the red tape to allow you to do more of your projects to drive down the cost of housing and serve more people?
Many try, and a lot of what we're able to succeed at in many places like Los Angeles and around the country are preservation of older properties that have potentially are falling out of the housing supply because they need renovations. And so we generally...
Is this a dense supply, or is this like single family?
No, this would be an existing apartment community that might have some challenges and is run down, and that we acquire and renovate. And I think the gentleman, the point about displacement, I mean, one of the things that we try to do in our investments is to retain 75 to 80% of the existing residents when we do an acquisition and a rehab. Because we have found, and the other thing that we found, that the model of mixed income communities really work. And that's one of the things we've got to figure out how to do, where we're not segregating low-income people all in one place.
So maybe beyond the land costs and maybe the labor costs, is it no more expensive to build in LA compared to other parts of the country that you work in because of rules and regulations? Are they pretty good on rules and regulations?
No, I would say it costs. We have two properties that we're working on right now. It's similar spec. One is $500,000 a unit to build. We're looking at it in the state of Michigan, and it's $250,000.
So half the price.
Yes.
And I guess that's my point. And if those costs come to bear on the zoning, on the regulatory side, in the local communities, and those same local communities are having problems with homelessness and affordable housing, don't we start to say, hey, Congress, you guys might have to spend some more money, But shouldn't we also be putting pressure on local communities to say, streamline this stuff so we can help you fix your problem?
Absolutely.
Right?
Congressman Duffy, can I respond to that as
Sure.
well? So absolutely, I agree that we have to look at zoning and land use regulations that are driving up the cost of any type of housing or even prohibiting any kind of multifamily housing from being built, which is raising costs for everyone. That is an essential piece of the puzzle to solving the housing crisis. Even were we to do so, when we do so, I think we already heard our colleagues from the home builders, we've heard economists and others agree that those homeless households that you referenced in LA will not find housing that's affordable to them. So while we have to do what we can to eliminate restrictive zoning, lower costs for everybody, that affordability will not trickle down to the lowest income households. For them, government subsidy, government intervention
But making
is
sure we can have
essential.
affordable houses, affordable housing for
It's
more
all part of
people,
the spectrum,
make sure we have less people who are on the streets. And so I agree with you, but my point is this has to be a holistic approach. And I was going to get to Ms. Todman because in her testimony she cited a study that actually references back to the cost of regulation in these projects. And again, I'm about what are the dollars, what are the regulation, how do we look at this in the 21st century with new data, new information, and a new vision?
The
I yield
gentleman from
back.
Florida, Mr. Lawson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I guess my time is done.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all. Welcome to the committee. I've never heard my name called so much in committee. I've been attempted to answer a lot of questions when they call on Mr. Lawson. Yeah. Thank you. My question is in terms of public housing, and I might be a little bit off, and maybe Mr. Lawson, anyone can help me. With the new millennium group that is that living in housing every place, is it possible in this legislation that we have to create a portion of the rent going into what I would consider as housing IRAs, so that you can move individuals from public housing into home ownership? And maybe I might be a little bit off on that, but Mr. Lawson, Mr. Carter, anyone can comment on it. I want to know whether that's possible.
I don't have specific information on that, but I know that those programs do exist, and where a portion of the rent is set aside for down payment assistance and other things. Perhaps Ms. Todman and Ms. Yentel could speak to that.
What Mr. Lawson is referring to, one particular tool that housing authorities use is a family self-sufficiency program, which allows households to increase their income as they get a job or a better job. And the net new rent that would occur because of their increased income is placed into an escrow account by the housing authority, or in some cases these days, private affordable housing providers. And as that escrow grows, housing authorities will be able to use it as a down payment toward a home or other family goals. So that tool does exist, and it's a very powerful tool. It's not spoken of a lot, but family self-sufficiency is probably one of the best responses to helping families move up and out of public housing and a voucher program that exists today.
Would anyone else like to, Mr. Carter?
You know, one of the things that we do with some of our banking partners is we do financial literacy programs at many of our apartment communities. And, you know, one of the things that we've learned, and particularly in affordable housing communities, is that if we notice, for instance, people are paying with a cashier's check or cash, that means they're doing check cashing. And if you could just get them into the banking system, the standard banking system, you've given them a 5 to 10% raise because they're not paying those check cashing fees. And so the other thing that I wish, my wish list for renters, is that more of rental stability where people have paid their rent gets reflected into their credit score where they can eventually buy a house. I mean, right now, from what I see, that rental credit history doesn't seem to move the needle as much in the credit scoring as other things. So.
Yeah, Ms. Yentel.
Yes, thank you. So the family self-sufficiency program is very important, and it does exactly what you're suggesting, and I think looking for ways to assist low-income residents who are able to reach home ownership, we should. But we should also recognize that the vast majority of residents in the public housing program that you mentioned specifically, the vast majority of them are seniors, they're people with disabilities, or they're people who are in the labor force, and they're working very low-wage jobs, and the kind of jobs where it's difficult to cobble together enough hours in a week or in a month to make ends meet. This will be an issue for the foreseeable future. So as was raised earlier, it's not just a housing issue, it's a wage issue. So the Department of Labor projects jobs to have the greatest growth, and 7 out of 10 of the jobs that are projected to have the greatest growth over the next 10 years pay less than what it costs to rent a one-bedroom apartment. So the problem is not just, it's not that people aren't working hard enough, it's that jobs don't pay enough to cover the cost of rising rents.
Yeah, and I'm about out of time, but I want to think, these groups like Millennium and so forth that takes these housing projects and they don't reinvest into them. Ms. Todman, can you tell me how, should that be a part of this legislation to make them more accountable?
And which groups are you referring to, sir?
Different groups that have these federal housing programs where they get dilapidated. And
Right.
I guess I yield back with me back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing on a very important topic. And one of the provisions in the draft legislation that I want to address that I think is a follow-up on what Mr. Duffy talked about is, and I think it merits consideration, I think it's a great idea, is that in the bill there's a provision that would reward community development block grant recipients with additional funding if they demonstrate they're eliminating or reducing impact fees. And while I do think impact fees can be used for positive things like making sure sewer lines and other infrastructure are in place for growing communities, I suspect that in some instances, city planners and city policymakers have used such fees to make the economics of development too high. My first question for Mr. Carter and Mr. Lawson is, have you ever seen a circumstance where impact fees made building affordable housing too high? Mr. Lawson first?
Yeah, absolutely. In my earlier example, I was noting a municipality in which I built both affordable housing under the low-income housing tax credit and market rate luxury townhomes. The tax credit, affordable apartments, the tap and impact fees were $11,000 per unit.
Wow.
For the $325,000 townhomes, the fee was $13,000 a unit. So
a lot more for the affordable housing and really changes
more.
the economics.
Precisely.
Do you have a similar
Well,
view, Mr. Carter?
I would just maybe touch on a philosophy that exists broadly, both locally and even to programs at HUD. They are really designed, they are disincentives and they're designed to catch the bad actors, if you will. In the sense of, if you look at things like, for instance, Section 8 housing, which we have about half of our inventory.
I want to get to that in a second. Yep, keep moving.
But clearly, one of the things that, there need to be more incentives versus penalties. That's
Great.
the
Thank you.
philosophical.
That's great. The next thing I want to cover is lawsuit abuse with regard to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. And while I support both of the goals of those pieces of legislation, in many cases, there are folks, and I've seen examples in my districts, that have a sue and settle mentality, that aren't interested in fixing any of the violations. They're only interested in pulling money out of the system. Mr. Lawson and Mr. Carter, I'll start with Mr. Carter this time. Have you seen any examples of this frivolous legal activity that actually increases the cost of affordable housing?
Not for us.
Not for you. Mr. Lawson, have you seen any of that?
We have experienced it, not personally, in our market, and NAHB for a long time has advocated for a safe harbor accessibility provision where we have numerous different regulations that come into play, and we're not always sure. And our professional consultants, our architects, can't always say, you're 100% fine if you do A, B, and C. That's a challenge.
One of the things that I've pushed for is a right to cure, which would ensure the violations get fixed and doesn't make it about just money to these organizations. Since you've seen some of this, Mr. Lawson, do you think a right to cure would make affordable housing more affordable while still living up to the ideals of the ADA and the Fair Housing Act?
Yes, I would agree.
Thank you. One more question I have for Mr. Carter is, and you started to talk about it, is can you talk about what could be done to make building managers more likely to participate in HUD's Section 8 program?
Is to create consistent standards across public housing authorities that they have to do inspections within a certain period of time and the like, but developing a set of standards that are consistent, because HUD deals with, again, over, I think it's 3,000 or 4,000 different public housing authorities. Consistency there, and again, we deal with 45, and 1 to 45 are very, very different.
So, Mr. Carter, what you're saying is owners of apartment and building managers want consistency and certainty across jurisdictions so that they can understand what they're dealing with, and that would make Section 8 housing more attractive as an alternative or a way to get involved in affordable housing.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. I yield back the balance of my time.
You're so welcome. The gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm listening very intently, and I'm finding a lot of interesting connotations in the conversation. It sounds like, in the interest of trying to move forward this legislation to provide funding for affordable housing, there's a resistance or a hesitation to do so if we don't pursue deregulation perhaps first. And I think that deregulating makes sense to a certain extent, but I don't think we should be abdicating our responsibilities to address the affordable housing crisis in this country. We shouldn't be abdicating that responsibility to localities which we do not have any jurisdictions over. I think that maybe perhaps in our role we can influence our respective districts to address whatever is holding back the development opportunities in the regulatory framework. But I think that we need to stay focused on what our duties are here and now with respect to this particular piece of legislation. And in the context of that, I wanted to talk about how we're looking at, I think, two different arenas here, really, and we're comparing them in ways that I don't think are very accurate, at least not an accurate reflection of what we're dealing with in those two particular areas. Mr. Carter, you basically, your interest in the whole affordable housing arena is focused on private capital and utilizing private capital to address the public housing issues in this country. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in the earlier conversation, it was talked about how your target range is about $7,000 to $20,000 as a cost basis when it comes to rehabbing existing structures for affordable housing purposes.
Yes, sir.
And it was also mentioned in that conversation that the $55,000 per unit cost that's going to be addressed in this particular legislation is, well, it was intonated that it was higher than what your costs are, but the whole purpose of your operation is to pursue those kind of projects that have the least amount of cost and the highest rate of return. Is that correct?
I would say that those that have the appropriate risk-adjusted return, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Ms. Todman, you represent the agencies.
That's correct.
And this $55,000 per unit public housing cost is to address the agency concern. Ms. Yentel, you spoke about how the agency rehabilitation issues have been underfunded for decades.
Yes.
And it's been cut off by as much as 50% over the last almost 20 years.
That's right.
Now, I think that we can get the private sector and the public sector to agree that when you defer maintenance for that long, the cost to rehab those units increases exponentially over time. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can we get a consensus across the board on that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the underinvestment over all these decades is, I would argue, a large cost component of why we're talking about $55,000 per unit today, as opposed to $7,000 or $20,000 per unit for a private firm that's able to go out and almost pick and choose what projects to undertake. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Do we have consensus on that across the board?
I would simply say that we may be comparing apples and oranges in that case, because I think the level of capital needs and the level of deferment of the deferral of maintenance in some of the public housing portfolio would be much greater than that which Mr. Carter, than a property that Mr. Carter might be buying.
So I'm glad we're able to get that on the record, because I don't want us to, I think we're all on the same page here. I think that we definitely need to support and deregulate to allow for the private investment to continue to help meet those demands, so that we don't have to invest public money in the areas where the private investment isn't going to flow towards. I think that we just both have to figure out how to find that happy yin and yang here. I did want to talk about something that was mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Sherman, about rents are too damn high and wages are too damn low. And I think that, of course, that formula factors into the equation when it comes down to affordable housing. Ms. Yentel, you mentioned a single person with a disability relying on an annual income of just over $10,000 from supplemental security income is an example of inadequate income to meet housing needs. Is that correct?
Well, it's an example of an extremely low-income household, and they are the households who have the most severe shortages of homes affordable and available to them, yes.
Right. And so I wanted to just kind of reference that when I make this point here, and that is that while I know that your purposes are to advocate for housing in particular, I think that because we just have so much crossover here in the need for housing and the need for incomes that can afford that housing, I would ask that your organizations begin exploring the availability of their testimony to actually speak towards the income issues in this community. And one of them in particular, and I'll end with this, is that Guam as a territory does not get SSI. We don't even have that $10,000. And I just wanted to close by asking across the board, your organizations are all national organizations. Does that include territorial data?
Yes.
Yeah, NARA does, yes.
Where the data is available, yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate you holding the hearing here today. I'd like to be able to describe a little bit of what we have in my district. We have some resort communities that have developed building for a specific clientele. But here is part of the challenge. The plans were not put in place for the lower income folks who are going to be the workers that are going to be in those communities. We also have a second challenge, come from rural Colorado. We have the statistical information to be able to support that we have a lower per capita income. However, some of the regulations that are applied at the state level and even at the local level as well are increasing some of those housing costs that are making those homes less affordable. And I want to be very clear. A lot of the regulations happen to be very good. To be able to have a fire alarm within your home, carbon monoxide detectors, good ideas to be able to have those. But Mr. Carter, you had mentioned that earlier in your testimony that you were dealing with 6 public housing agencies. You just mentioned 45 different regulators just a little bit ago that you're having to be able to deal with. When we are looking at the cost of an actual home, or for a place for people to be able to rent, how much is added on to the cost of those units from the cost of regulations that the people have to be able to pay?
We think 30%, 30% or more.
And arguably, some of those regulations are obviously good, to be able for the safety and soundness of the community.
Yes, sir.
Is there a better way? When you were just describing, when Mr. Stivers was questioning you, having to deal with a variety of different folks in terms of the regulations, does that increase your cost as well? Would effectively 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 stop shopping, would that be a better way to be able to do business?
Well, what I mentioned is we operate in affordable housing communities with over 45 different public housing agencies. So I have a team, I have a staff of 10 people that just deal with our compliance issues.
10 people. And
Yes.
so that does drive up the cost
Yes,
for
sir.
people with lower incomes to be able to get that type of housing. It seems to me, we're dealing with this from the federal end. If you were to make just an educated guess in terms of some of the regulatory costs, is a heavier burden from the federal side or from the state and local side?
State and local.
State and local side. Yeah. So what is happening at the state and local level in terms of creating affordable housing for people in those resort communities, in areas with lower incomes, is actually creating a hardship on people?
Yes, sir.
Great. So do you have some ideas on how to best address that?
Well, certainly, the area that you mentioned specifically, your district, I mean, we own a property in Naples, Florida, which is a perfect example of a community that is a very high-end community, and a lot of resorts, and then a lot of workforce that has to support that. And I do think the low-income housing tax credit is still the best way to produce housing units for that segment in those communities.
Great. Mr. Larson, do you have some comments on that?
Yes. Obviously, there are a lot of things that affect the cost, but the risk is very much one of those. And the state and local regulatory processes are a big piece of that. It can sometimes take us, as Mr. Carter said, years to get something done. Your investment is at risk that entire time, and that to create more certainty, to streamline that process, sounds like a great idea. I think we've discussed here, other people have discussed the idea of creating an incentive in order for streamlining that process. The incentive, the federal incentive, could perhaps affect the state and local behavior.
Well, great. And appreciate your comments on this because it's a multi-leveled issue that we've got to be able to deal with, impacting people at home. And we do need to be cautious and aware as well. There is no free, literally, in the world. Be it a federal incentive, there are going to be costs that will be associated with that ultimately those same people that we're talking about that are having a hard time maybe being able to make that mortgage or that rent payment are going through taxes to be able to have to assume some of that cost. Simplification, good streamlining, which is what we do in the private sector, is something I think is something that we ought to be aspiring to. And again, Madam Chair, appreciate you holding the hearing today.
Thank you.
Yield back.
The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Talib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. The average price for homes in Detroit is about $30,000, an affordable rate for home buyers in my district. Despite this, since the early 2000s, we've saw more drop of black home ownership than any other state in the country. Traditional banks are carrying out the very practices outlawed by the Fair Housing Act, a 50-year-old law that banned racial discrimination lending and refusing to offer mortgages for low-income borrowers for less than $50,000. Currently, the city has over 43,000 vacant homes, so Detroit, unlike similar cities, have both an increase in demand and supply of housing stock. So, Ms. Yentel, can you talk about the challenges buyers typically face when attempting to get smaller mortgage loans?
So thank you for the question, and you're right to be concerned. We share your concern about minority home ownership, and in fact today, as you mentioned the numbers in Detroit and beyond, nationally, black home ownership levels are lower today than they were before the Fair Housing Act was enacted. So clearly we have a long way to go and more to do to ensure that access to credit becomes possible for historically underserved communities. It's a place where Fannie and Freddie play an important role, and it's one of the reasons why we have to ensure, as we address comprehensive housing finance reform, that access to credit for historically underserved communities remains available.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in their duty to serve efforts to preserve affordable housing. How can we get there to facilitate these financing of smaller mortgages? What can we do as public servants and Congress members to push for that initiative?
Well, I think duty to serve is an important initiative, and it's something that Fannie and Freddie, it's relatively new. It's something Fannie and Freddie are starting and doing well. It's requiring more thought and more initiative, more innovation in serving historically underserved communities, including renters in rural communities, including manufactured housing residents. So I think, one, ensuring that we retain duty to serve and continue to allow for this innovation to happen and measure what's working and what isn't, and then work to take to scale the lessons that we learn from that.
Thank you. Ms. Todman, what can be done under the Community Reinvestment Act to ensure that banks are properly being examined by the Office of Currency Comptroller to receive the CRA credit?
I think that oversight is everything, and I believe in trust but verifying. And so if there are situations, if there are situations where our financial institutions have made commitments, we need to make sure at the local level that those commitments are kept, and the outreach to those areas that, but for that kind of investment from financial institutions, then community amenities and housing improvements would not occur. And I look at programs like New Market Tax Credits as a place that it's easy for financial institutions to put in an infusion of equity and be able to improve what's happening inside the community.
Because residents in Detroit in the 13th Congressional District are locked out of traditional mortgage market, they are often forced to borrow from non-banking lending institutions. Even high rates of land contracts are just out of control. Are the largest source of mortgage loans right now, which are outside of obviously the purview of Community Reinvestment Act regulations. And this is something that I'm increasingly becoming more passionate about, these kind of loopholes and the need to update the CRA. Ms. Yentel, can you talk a bit about the risks of consumers are faced with right now when borrowing from non-banking institutions?
So I have to be honest and say that's outside of my area of expertise.
But I would, first of all, I grew up in your district, so I know it very well.
Then we're brother and sister now. So.
Yeah, I went to Cass Tech High School.
Oh, yeah, Southwestern.
But we actually are involved in Detroit now in developing new apartments there. And one of the things that we believe that part of everyone certainly, it's a great objective to buy a home, but quality rentals are needed there as well. And we find that there's a lack of quality rentals, and we're in the process of developing a new property on the north end of Detroit. And we think it's a great market.
Mr. Carter, what do you mean quality renters? Because I have articles that say rising rents, falling wages, Detroit's poor face housing crisis. For some, the price is just, it's just.
We will have affordable apartments where we're building.
But the definition of affordable, this is like definition of I'm sorry, Chairwoman, maybe we could talk offline, but the definition of affordable is the issue. And we need to really have a serious conversation about that.
The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for holding this important hearing. Mr. Carter, included with your testimony were some articles that tell your story and the creative solutions that you've offered and developed to improve the lives of tenants and communities, and we're very impressed with your story and your commitment to serving these communities. I wanted to ask about how we might attract more private capital in the development of apartments and multifamily housing, as opposed to just always resorting to more taxpayer expenditures. There's a lot of things that we can do, I think, to change the way we do business in this country to attract private capital. And one government program that actually I think does a pretty good job of this is the RAD program. Ms. Todman, I think you may have testified about this earlier. And I'll get to that in a minute. But before we get to that, could you expand a little bit on your testimony about the changes to the retooling of the Community Reinvestment Act that could really help in this regard?
Well, I would say the first one would be that the old assessment districts aren't necessarily aligned to where the need is. And so there are certain banks that say, well, I can't invest there because my assessment district is here. And the reality of it is, it would be great that if it's affordable housing that serves an underserved market wherever it is, that the banks get credit for it.
Let me ask also about your testimony about opportunity zones. There's a lot of investors that are very interested in this, but I think there's still some uncertainty with the Treasury rollout. As you look at this, at the tax bill, are opportunity zones, tell me how opportunity zones are going to attract private capital, and are the rules that you're seeing so far, are they positioned to attract that private capital?
I would say yes. I think there was a big uncertainty that came out of it last week. One of the issues, though, is the challenge in developing new things, and the time frames are very, very. The opportunity zone legislation requires that we get things processed quickly, where there's certainty as to what fees and things are there. which doesn't exist today, and that's where we have to get the.
So maybe a message to the local governments is, look at those opportunity zones, look at your local regulations.
Yes, sir.
And match those up.
Yes, sir.
That could really help supercharge the opportunity zones.
Yes, sir.
In my district, we have an outstanding community leader, PG Peoples, who is the CEO of the Lexington Urban League, and a city council member, also James Brown, who is, they both come to me and talk to me about the need for more affordable housing, and yet at the same time, the problem of gentrification. Can you talk a little bit about how we can do some of these things to invite more private capital, to revitalize opportunity zones in other neighborhoods without the problem of displacement?
Well, I think that's the key. We have to be inclusive. We have to keep people who are there, and we have to me, we have to add additional levels of income to a community to make it viable. I believe that a diversity of incomes will make a stronger community. We own mixed income properties. I can tell you where we range from 50%, 40% of AMI to market rate units, and those are some of our most successful communities.
Great, and Ms. Todman, back to you on RAD. The Lexington Housing Authority is a moving to work jurisdiction. They're doing some great things. Austin Sims leads that agency. I don't know if you know Austin,
Yeah, Mr. Sims.
but they're taking advantage of RAD. And RAD is a great opportunity to take old, dilapidated public housing stock, invite private investment, which is great for those tenants, and convert those into project-based Section 8. To me, this sounds like a great way to both rehab our existing public housing stock while at the same time, save some taxpayer dollars and invite more private capital in.
Sure. So Mr. Sims is a colleague of mine, and he is able to marry two programs, RAD and Moving to Work, and have it be used to increase the capital, increase the improvements in his units. But that is sometimes unique to agencies like in Lexington that have all of those tools in the toolkit. For a fair amount of our members, RAD, as powerful a tool as it is and as successful as it can be, it is not always the tool for all agencies. And so I think an infusion of capital funds will help those agencies. And for those who can use RAD and capitalize on it, it's a tool for the future.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Mrs. Presley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
First, I want to say thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for renewing this committee's sense of urgency around this issue and reframing the conversation to reflect the real gravity of it. In 2013, a national infrastructure protection plan was released outlining 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Of the 16, not one was housing or shelter. Just to be clear for the purposes of the record, would the four of you indicate by show of hands, do you believe it is vital that we recognize our nation's housing supply as critical infrastructure if we are serious about addressing our current housing crisis? Show of hands. Yes. Let the record reflect, okay? Enthusiastic showing, thank you. In cities across the country, including those in my district, the Massachusetts 7th, the housing supply lacks both in quantity and quality. In Cambridge, one housing property alone vacated 57 housing units as a result of hazardous mold. Now, we know that multifamily units and apartments house a large proportion of low-income families, and while some are in good shape, many of these buildings have deteriorated and do require significant renovations. Unfortunately, these situations are plagued by split incentives, where owners see repairs more as sunken costs than as investments in their properties. Mr. Carter, would you say that because of split incentive, many building owners choose not to make these needed repairs, and many residents contend with poor and subpar housing conditions?
I would say that as an industry, I believe that, and I know as a company, we focus on making those investments because the most important thing to us is the safety and wellness of our residents. So we do make those investments and we cure those situations.
Would anyone else like to comment before I move on? Mr. Lawson?
I would just say that within the industry, within any industry, there are good participants and there are bad participants. And we all know that there are a small percentage, I think, of landlords who do not keep up their building. We welcome, as an industry, we welcome our local codes officials putting pressure we think they should be even more
Thank you.
aggressive.
Reclaiming my time. Okay, very good. When I serve on the City Council, I chair the Public Health Committee, and we spoke often about the weathering effect that we learned about through the Mass Community Health Center, where they surveyed low-income residents in public housing about how bad did they think their children's asthma rates were. And they put it in like the 3 to 5 range, but when they were tested, they were actually at life-threatening risk, 8 to 10. And so we know that housing is a fundamental and critical determinant of public health. And repeated studies have shown this link between housing stability and health outcomes. The current state of much of our housing supply poses a literal hazard to families and particularly children. One 2-year study by the Boston Housing Authority at the Mary Ellen McCormick neighborhood found a 47% reduction rate in asthma symptoms, asthma attacks, ER visits, school absences when tenants moved out of older apartments into newly renovated units. This reality is no clearer than with the story of a constituent of mine, Angelo, who first came to the Boston Medical Center Grow Clinic at 8 months old, but was the size of a 4-month-old. He and his mom were living in an overcrowded apartment, sleeping in the living room with a leaking ceiling, infestations of mice and cockroaches, among other things. He developed allergies and was so weak he could not raise his head up. Since then, as a result of moving into quality public housing, he has now started to thrive, to gain weight, and hit the necessary developmental milestones to enroll in daycare. Ms. Yentel, do you agree that housing is a critical determinant of health?
Absolutely, and if I could add, I would say, I think you raised such an important point, not only for the individual costs to children and to families, but to the federal government through inaction. So we're talking a lot about what are the benefits of a major investment and infusion of funds to repair public housing and build more. Inaction is expensive. We're paying for housing instability and homelessness one way or another, and as you raised, we're paying for it through increased health costs. When people are affordably housed, their visits to primary care physicians increase by 22%, their visits to the emergency room decrease by 18%, Medicaid costs fall by 12%. There was a study in your backyard from Children's Health Watch in a group of pediatricians out of Boston that found that over the next 10 years, we will spend $111 billion in avoidable health care costs because of housing instability and housing insecurity.
And so one more time, just for the record, in your opinion, do you believe the current level of funding poses a risk to the public health of our children and families?
I do. Yes.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The Chairwoman's draft legislation calls for $92.1 billion for housing infrastructure. This is double the entire budget of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I think the private sector, of which I'm part of, will have an important role in solving an affordable housing issue, and I am not convinced that throwing this much money at a problem, as the government sometimes does, will solve the underlying issues that led us here in the first place. So, Mr. Lawson, my first question to you is, what do you view as the most effective way for the public and private sectors to work together to help solve the affordable housing problem that we have here in this country?
Again, while it's not under the jurisdiction of this committee, I think the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program has been the most successful affordable housing program that the country has ever created. That works in conjunction, however, with a lot of funding, a lot of programs that are under the jurisdiction of this committee. I think the reason that the tax credit program works so well is it marries the private sector discipline with the public sector resource of the tax credits, and everyone has a responsibility. The responsibility of the resident, on one hand, is to pay their rent and pay it on time. The responsibility of the owner is to rent to income-qualified people. If that doesn't happen, then there are very serious penalties at play.
Thank you. Mr. Carter.
Yes, sir.
Your LLC manages over 8,000 units in 12 states, as we've heard today. This is a very impressive accomplishment. You were able to find a free market solution to help solve the affordable housing crisis. And I think this is the beauty of capitalism. So before I continue my question, Mr. Carter, are you a capitalist or are you a socialist?
Capitalist.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Now, the economy is strong. I think we'll all agree with that. There are more jobs than people looking, and the economy grew at an impressive rate. We found out at 3.2% in the first quarter of 2019, which surpassed almost every economist's projection. So, Mr. Carter, on page 6 of your testimony, you talk about the intersection of jobs, affordable housing, and infrastructure. So can you please elaborate on what role jobs play in this discussion?
Well, certainly, as we create jobs, for instance, Amazon. I mean, people look at that and they see Jeff Bezos, but the reality of it is that it creates lots of jobs for people who make $40,000 to $50,000 a year in warehouses. And those are the people that we house. So that's, you know, as we even create technology jobs and things like that, there is a very, very close relationship, jobs and the need for people to live close by. I mean, one of the areas that, you know, university towns, we own in Boulder and also Poughkeepsie, New York, huge demand for people that work at the universities.
Mr. Lawson, you mentioned in your testimony that the shortage of new housing units in low and moderate income families reflect the market reality, not a lack of interest in serving the population. We've heard testimony today that local policies have a significant effect on construction prices of affordable housing units. So my question would be, from a federal level, how can we better get the numbers to reflect the market reality if we are hindered by over-regulation at the local level?
I think we can create incentives for local municipalities to streamline their regulations and to adopt less restrictive land use policies. A lot of zoning ordinances in suburban areas, which is a lot of the area in which I work, are by definition exclusionary. They're excluding the least expensive home and apartment types.
Okay, my last question to you, Mr. Carter, is to piggyback off my previous question to Mr. Lawson. Your company's found a way to make the numbers work and are operating in 12 different states, as we've said. Studies have shown that local regulations can account for over 30% of the cost of development and renovation of apartment complexes. So what are some of the unique regulatory challenges that you are facing in development in Southern California versus the one right outside my district in Austin, Texas?
I would say that the environmental regulations are a lot tougher in California than Texas. That's one. I would say that the ability to get density is easier in Texas than California.
Yeah. And we have no personal income tax either in Texas.
Yes, sir.
I yield the rest of my time back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. McAdams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here today. As a former mayor myself, I worked on housing issues on a daily basis, and we certainly struggled with many of the same concerns that you all have raised in your testimonies. That is, how to incentivize affordable housing development, how to plan for development projects in a way that made sense for our communities, our schools, and our existing infrastructure, and how to do it financially. And planning for our existing infrastructure and integrating housing with our infrastructure, that's the part I want to focus on in my questions. So, Mr. Carter, in your written testimony, you note that, quote, infrastructure and housing are linked in significant ways. You go on to note that, quote, contemporaneous consideration of housing demands and infrastructure needs maximizes community benefit and promotes efficiencies in transportation, land use, and public works. In short, what I believe you're referring to is the need for smart growth and thoughtful city planning that links jobs with housing and with infrastructure investments, and not to look at these as separate activities and endeavors of their own right, but collectively how we're connecting people to the opportunities that they desire to access. So housing is linked to jobs, is linked to a transportation infrastructure. So, Mr. Carter, can you elaborate on one point that you were making in your testimony, how important it is to link affordable housing development with infrastructure investments, and what benefits can this bring to those cities and to those residents?
Well, I think that thank you very much for that question, that in the creation of jobs, I believe that in most industries there's a diversity of different workers at different salary levels, which really reflect the need for housing at a variety of different levels. So we've seen it with technology. I mean, people assume that every tech worker is a millionaire, but the fact is there are a lot that work in doing things where they make, support staff. So you need housing for those people as well.
And Mr. Lawson, as a developer yourself, how does access to transportation influence where you seek to put a project? And how often are the cities you interact with trying to link jobs and housing with their infrastructure investments?
I think that's a great question, because I think we can do a much better job of aligning our transportation and our housing. And that has been a struggle, I can say in my hometown, that's been a big struggle. It's been a political struggle to the extent that we can, again, create positive incentives for municipalities to align those two. I think the outcome would be better.
So, the title of this hearing today is Housing is Infrastructure. And I think that's right, that housing is a critical piece of infrastructure. But I also think it's important to note that a bus line or a transit line or a road is part of our housing infrastructure, that housing in a silo, people don't just live in the place of their residence, they have to get to work. And so looking at housing not in a silo, but as it relates to their transportation choices, I think is important. So I'm curious if anyone on the panel has any recommendations that we could pursue legislatively to incentivize smarter housing growth strategies that ensure affordable housing development has access to our transportation resources, such as rail or bus.
I think, again, what we've talked about and I think one of the other Congress people here said that we give away a lot of money for transportation to localities, but we don't require anything in return. Perhaps this is an opportunity.
Okay. I think that gets at some of my concerns, which is, and as I've seen affordable housing projects come forward, trying to make this pencil, even with LIHTC and other incentives is difficult. And so oftentimes we find affordable housing on the land that's less desirable, which means then once the housing's built, the residents have to have a car, have to have gas, have to walk long distances to work, and other unintended consequences of the location. And yet land next to our transit is more expensive, but maybe better capable of sustaining these developments and a better quality of life for those residents in the development.
I would say I had the great joy of being in Utah and St. George for Utah's narrow chapter meeting, and I was impressed by the level of growth happening there, particularly from a job perspective, but had lots of questions about the low-income individuals who are in those jobs and how they were able to move around. Every city has their consolidated plan that they are to submit to HUD to receive some funds. I do believe that there's an intersect between a conversation on housing and transportation that occurs there, and maybe that's some place we can look to have localities step up.
Thank you. I'm interested in that, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the committee or the panel and your testimony here today. Housing is something that we're dealing with, even in my district back in Georgia. I met with one of our manufacturers recently and asked them, what's the number one issue? I anticipated trade or, the economy, which was growing, that their answer would be the labor workforce. They told me their number one concern is the lack of starter single-family homes. Because what they've seen is there are numbers of people that could qualify for a mortgage today that couldn't 2 years ago because of how strong the economy is and how they're building their workforce. But there's no starter single-family homes for them to purchase in our areas, which was surprising to me. But even with that, with more people qualifying for homes, there's still a lot of Americans that home ownership is out of reach for various reasons. I've worked with several of these nonprofits. There's one that's Homes for Vets that actually will build homes for disabled veterans, and they give them a zero-interest mortgage going forward. They custom build these homes. I've had the honor of doing several ribbon cuttings, but also in my home state of Georgia, one of the largest nonprofits is Habitat for Humanity that actually will build homes for those that home ownership is just out of reach. And as we're looking at some things we can do, there's one thing that we could do that's pretty simple. It's a bill that I actually passed unanimously out of this committee last Congress and passed out of the House. Unfortunately, it didn't go anywhere in the Senate. That would provide some regulatory relief for these nonprofits. The TRID rule is making it more difficult for the nonprofits because you got a 2,000-page regulation that organizations like these have to comply with, which in many cases requires a full-time compliance person, and these are nonprofits that some of them have just said it's not worth doing. It's too onerous for us to comply with such heavy-handed regulations that were actually designed for, large bank mortgage companies. And so the BUILD Act is what we introduced that would basically allow these nonprofits to go back to the pre-TRID reporting forms, just those that make the 0% mortgage loans, to allow them, to give them a little flexibility to go out and do more of what they do, building these affordable homes or zero interest mortgages for these low-income families. So my questions are really around that is, Ms. Yentel, can you discuss the important role that these nonprofits play in the nation's affordable housing arena?
So I'll have to look more closely at the BUILD Act to get back to you specifically on that. Nonprofits are an important part of our country's affordable housing solution, whether they are helping to provide low down payment, no down payment homes for those who can afford them, or whether they're developing and operating rental housing for the lowest income people.
Yeah, and that's really my question is what important role do they play? Yeah. And as I've seen, it's a very important role. It's another piece of the larger puzzle. Ms. Todman, should we be careful not to overregulate these companies that are these nonprofits that are there to provide a service, especially with regulations that are geared toward the huge, big, mega mortgage loan companies?
I would speak to regulation in general and say that where regulations get just past the tipping point of taking care of health and safety and get into having folks be more paper shufflers in terms of what their duties are, and there's a monetized impact to that, I do think we have to look very carefully of how that impacts housing affordability and the way that you're able to have new growth and preservation inside of an overregulated environment.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Lawson, how do private sector home builders partner with these nonprofits?
We've partnered with a number of nonprofits, mostly on the multifamily side, within the context of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program that our state creates incentives for. But I think we do, what we should do is align incentives. We should look at the goal first and not look at the taxability, yay or nay, of a particular practitioner in the market. We should say, what is the best housing goal, and let's create incentives for it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can move this bill forward again this Congress. Now yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I know that you all have already talked about this, but I just wanted to get it clearly on the record because having grown up poor in South Texas and in a 4-room, only a kitchen, no bathroom, no living room, a house, I've seen what the need for housing was then, and I've been a social worker and visited many homes where, like mine, that there was 10 people and 10 children, 4 rooms, so you can imagine the crowded situation. I visited homes and they had same or similar conditions. When I block walk some of my own neighborhoods now, that still exists. So housing shortage is not a new problem. It's been around for a long time. And as much as we can say that private industry will take care of it and that the markets will take care of it, well, guess what? They really haven't. I think it's helped, but it really hasn't. So I just want to ask each one of you that just yes or no, do you all agree that without some government involvement, the market fails to develop any new low-income housing?
Yes.
Agreed.
Absolutely
Agreed. Now, I also was a legal aid lawyer in the housing section, and my favorite T-shirt actually said, housing for poor people, not profits. Now, Mr. Carter, you probably would disagree with that, and Mr. Lawson, you probably would too, because you all are here to make a profit. But you still utilize some of the incentives that we have, right?
Yes, we do.
Right. So which one do you think works best? And if you could just be brief, because I still have one more question.
I'd say Section 8, project-based Section 8, and the low-income housing tax credit.
I would say the tax credit because, as I said before, it marries that public subsidy with the private sector discipline. I think that public-private venture is what creates the sustainability long-term.
Okay. And Ms. Yentel, you talked about how there's different strategies and different levels of poverty, and the one that we really need different strategies for each. What can we be doing more for, like a lot that I see in my district, that it's still like the house that I grew up in, that's 4 rooms with, you know, it may not be 10 children from the one family. I was from a very large family, but in fact, it may be 10 children and 4 adults, and it's 2 or 3 different families living in it. I mean, what can we do to really reach the very lowest, the poorest of the poor of America?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the only segment of the population for which there's an absolute shortage of homes that are affordable and available to them are those extremely low-income households. The National Housing Trust Fund program is our country's newest and most deeply targeted housing program. It was created and designed precisely to meet this need, and at its current funding level, 100% of the dollars go to build or preserve apartments that are affordable to extremely low-income households. The first year's allocation of $174 million has resulted in about 1,900 units that have been developed that are housing some of the country's most vulnerable people, a lot of the people that you're talking about, people who would otherwise be living in severely overcrowded situations or would be sleeping in shelters. The only challenge with that program is that it's woefully underfunded compared to the overwhelming need. So an infrastructure spending package is an ideal opportunity to increase investments in this important program.
Right, and do you, you know, I feel like, you know, the mayor back here who, you know, housing is just the first start. I mean, but you also have to include the transportation and maybe wraparound services so that they can be able to maintain the home and address all their needs. So have you seen any strategies that really work by combining the housing assistance with the wraparound services needed so that someone can really get the lift up?
Sure, I mean, Housing First is a good example of that, and it's the model that we use today to help end homelessness in communities across the country. And while some people experiencing homelessness or some extremely low-income renters may have challenges in their lives that go beyond housing affordability, until people are affordably housed, they can't effectively address those other issues. So the idea is first, get people housed in homes that are decent, safe, affordable, accessible, and then the wraparound services can help them address other issues in their lives to maintain those homes, to address accessibility issues, mental health issues, and beyond. But that the home and living in a safe, stable, affordable environment is essential to success in those other areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I thank our guests, our witnesses today for your expertise in the matters before us. You know, affordable housing is important in every district. It's certainly important in Ohio's 8th district. We have pockets of great wealth, but we also have right nearby pockets where people are struggling to find affordable housing. Our rural communities are, even though the net cost is fairly low by national standards, struggling to find affordable housing. And I just want to understand how, when we look at the ability to afford housing, normally you would think income growth is key. And when you look at the economy that we've been under for the past couple years, and certainly the economy, the numbers look great. 3.2% GDP growth in the first quarter, 3% personal disposable income. So that's the cash that you have to pay your bills with in the household. That's gone up by 3%. And it's not always where the GDP is going up and wages are going up. We've seen the GDP go up and wages remain stagnant. So thankfully, both trends are positive. And I'm finding it odd that as I look at our spending on federal housing subsidies, we're spending more money on poverty assistance. We have a safety net, and America values the safety net. But you would think that as the economy heats up, as people are more fully employed than they've ever been in many of our communities, and certainly by demographics, record low levels of unemployment, yet we spend more money on federal housing subsidies. I mean, we're spending more money with 3.8% unemployment than we were spending at 10% unemployment right after the Great Recession. So could you guys briefly offer, Ms. Yentel, start with you, why would that be?
So the economy is working well for some of the mostly higher income households. Lower income earners, for them, the economy hasn't gotten much better because they don't have stocks in the stock market.
Wages are up. Wages are up for everybody. Thanks, Ms.
For the
Todman.
lowest income people, wages have predominantly been stagnant and are just now beginning to
That's true for this century. It's not true for the past couple years.
It
Ms.
is
Todman,
true, and if we look at the
it's
jobs...
not a debate. Ms. Todman, the time is mine.
Yeah,
Please answer.
I would say that you have a lot of middle-class families coming out of the Great Recession that are still catching up in terms of what their housing needs are, and only just beginning to see the impact of the economic improvements that you suggest. I also say another issue is just supply. We as a country are running into a supply issue. It relates to actual number of housing, which is why it is important to keep one important supply or public housing stock, and it is important for us to invest in other affordable housing units, and it's important for us to invest in market rate elsewhere. Supply is key to the cost of housing.
Thank you for that. And the reality is, while wages are going up, in the low-income portion, without some of the programs that we've talked about, there are challenges in meeting the needs because the market doesn't produce all of the affordable housing without some of the incentives we have. And as I go to Mr. Lawson and Mr. Carter, maybe you could highlight each briefly some of the hurdles that you run into, maybe begin with Mr. Carter. We've got all these programs. We spend nearly $900 billion a year on poverty assistance, over 92 programs. Some of them are duplicative. They all come with all kinds of rules and barriers. What are a couple that you find that would help you meet the needs better if we could get some reform?
Well, thank you for the question. One is just the cost of developing. And I just want to point out to your last question. We were involved in a project in downtown San Francisco, 2001. It was $200,000 a unit to build at Mission Bay. Today, it would cost $650,000 a unit to build.
Wow. Thank you. Mr. Lawson.
Supply and demand and the increase in construction costs. The scarcity of supply has driven housing costs higher than the increases in incomes.
Thank you. And as you look at the way some of the programs work, here's the piece, right? So even one of my Democratic colleagues was speaking about one of his two programs that he had been involved with as a former mayor. And one worked really efficiently. They would spend all the money. The other one didn't. There was money trapped there because there were a lot of rules. And as we look at that, we're going to spend, the proposal is to spend $92 billion more with no reforms. I mean, most people won't spend an extra $200 without expecting a better bang for the buck. And it's just shameful that we're not talking more seriously about reform. My time's expired and I yield. Thank you,
The
Madam Chair.
gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Todman, would you agree that if you try to make repairs to your home after 20 years of neglect, it would be much more expensive to repair at the end of that 20 years than if you just invest in routine maintenance?
Agreed, and my testimony speaks to that, and there's a chart that shows sort of the longitudinal impact of non-investment in the past several decades.
And Ms. Yentel, would you say that public housing is part of our national infrastructure?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, for more than 2 decades, the federal government neglected to make the New York City Housing Authority's developments. They failed to invest in them for more than 400,000 New Yorkers. And so now we have about 2 decades of complete neglect. And that bill for 2 decades of neglect is a lot bigger than if we had just invested in that routine maintenance. Would you agree with that, Ms. Yentel, Ms. Todman?
I agree.
Agreed.
So, people say the term they'll just throw out the term $32 billion. That is what is owed to New York City's Housing Authority alone, $32 billion. But what does that $32 billion in neglect look like? Well, we took up some stories from our district, and it seems this is what that $32 billion in neglect looks like. In one apartment in the Bronx, sewage flows into an apartment when it rains and water leaks through the roof. Children like Michaela Bonaparte have blood lead levels hitting 8 times the amount that prompts health department action. 800 children under the age of 6 living in NYCHA housing tested positive for high levels of lead between 2012 and 2016 during the federal disinvestment period. While already in decay, Hurricane Sandy devastated many housing developments whose boilers were located in the basement, and they already continue to struggle with that replacement. During the winter, residents have to open their gas ovens to heat their apartments because the disinvestment has prevented and tied the Housing Authority from being able to replace these heating systems. People are going without hot water and heating during the wintertime. In some cases, residents estimate heat in their apartments began to falter over 10 years ago, and they have to make do with space heaters in the middle of winter. Other residents have to put up with the stench of pervasive mold that triggers their asthma. Madam Chair, I seek unanimous consent to submit to the record multiple articles from the New York Times highlighting each and every one of these cases.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you so much. Ms. Yentel, do you believe that all of these horrific cases were necessary, or were they unnecessary in terms of the government's disinvestment?
There's certainly, those kind of health consequences are unnecessary and shameful and a direct result of disinvestment over decades into the repairs necessary to upkeep those homes.
So it was completely unnecessary for these kids to get lead in their blood. It was completely unnecessary for these families to live through winter without heat. It was completely unnecessary for these families and children to breathe in mold. And we did it anyway because we decided that their lives and that their housing was not worthy of federal investment. Would you say that's correct?
I would. I'd say that the funding that is required to keep those homes at a decent, safe level have been underfunded for decades. Funding for public housing repairs to repair all of those units that you're talking about were cut in half over the years 2000 to 2016 and continue to be terribly underfunded compared to the need.
So this is what we did.
Fixable.
And,
it's all fixable.
And thank you. And as we said that and as people made excuses that these investments were unaffordable and that there was no money, we exploded our military budget, we expanded fossil fuel subsidies to oil and gas companies, and we continued to provide tax cuts to corporations and the exceedingly wealthy that didn't need them. Yet at the same time, folks have the audacity to say that there's no money for public housing and that that we can't afford for children to have clean blood and clean water. I mean, this is morally wrong, and it's also fiscally unnecessary. I have one last question. As we transition to the necessity of green and clean energy, are there health benefits that are possible here? Can we create jobs for folks in housing, that are living in housing authority as we make that transition?
Certainly. I mean, the Section 3 program is one that, as we look at the capital fund as the tool, many housing authorities will use Section 3 as a way to employ residents, but also there's...
Time has expired.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for yielding and again for hosting this hearing. I want to start by highlighting the role that the insurance industry plays as an investor and supporter of American infrastructure projects. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness has an excellent report summarizing this. And Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to have consent that I can submit this into the record.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you. And to highlight some of the findings from the Chamber's report, of the roughly $6 trillion in investment assets held by insurers, about $1 trillion are held in municipal securities that are issued to fund our roads, our schools, and our hospitals, which of course is great infrastructure for housing. Insurers also directly invest in infrastructure projects, having provided $26 billion, or 6% of all private infrastructure investments in 2016 alone. Insurers also initiated 11% of all commercial real estate loans in 2017, valued around $54 billion. These figures show that the insurance industry plays an important and key role as an investor in American infrastructure. So, Mr. Carter, I'd like to ask you a question. I want to talk about regulatory burden with you just for a moment. According to the research from Hoyt Advisory Services commissioned by the National Apartment Association and the National Multifamily Housing Council, America needs to build more than 4.6 million new apartment homes at a variety of price points by the year 2030. So how can the federal government partner with private sector to better house our nation as well as help this nation's infrastructure needs?
Well, I thank you very much for your question. I think the first thing is to make it easier for private investors to invest. You mentioned insurance companies. That's about 10% of our investors are insurance companies. And the other important thing that people forget about the insurance industry is it plays a huge role in insuring what we do. And so in terms of our properties, and so over the last few years, we've had challenges with hurricane and windstorm, which has also increased our operating expenses that has impacted affordability. But I would say making it easier for them to invest in some of our apartment communities by eliminating some of the regulatory challenges and some of the uncertainty.
So eliminating regulatory challenges, any permitting challenges that are slowing down projects, make it harder to
Yes,
invest?
again, and those roadblocks, they impact the certainty of whether the viability of the project, when it will come on. Again, we have in many places around the country, it's 3 to 10 years before you get final approval to get a project done.
Understood. Another question, Mr. Carter. A recent study by the National Multifamily Housing Council and the National Association of Home Builders found that on average, 32% of multifamily development costs are attributable to the costs associated with complying with local, state, and federal regulation, like we just talked about. Can you please provide us with some examples of programs, practices, and regulations at the federal level that add to the cost of housing? So this really follows on with the last one, since you mentioned regulation being an obstacle. If you could give us some examples of.
Well, one is parking. I think today, and I mentioned that early, as society has evolved, I think the parking requirements are based on, where it used to be 1 car per bedroom, and people are driving less, and there's other, car sharing and things like that. And certainly more density. That's the big thing, being able to build, more units.
Mr. Lawson, with the same question, do you have some more obstacles that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, I have one example. Several years ago, we bought a parcel of property. We were going to build 96. Well, we ended up only being able to build 96 apartment units on it, affordable apartment units, because we found out there were wetlands on this parcel that was miles from water or any other tributaries or anything else. The regulations had changed the indicative species for a wetlands to include very common species, rendered this wet area wetlands, which then required mitigation, ended up costing about $150,000 and reducing what we could do with the property at the end of the day.
Understood. Environmental, parking, lots more. I'm sure the list could go on. I appreciate your time. And Madam Chair, I do yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all the panelists for their testimony and their replies to questions asked. I'd like to shine the spotlight on the Chicago metro region for a quick snapshot that I think is informative
nationally. I'd like to ask a question regarding the National Housing Trust Fund after sharing some data with you about affordable housing in the Chicagoland area. According, Ms. Yentel, according to your organization's analysis, there are about 92,000 plus affordable and available rental homes in the Chicago area, but about 326,000 extremely low-income renter households. That's right, 1 of 3 households in Chicago, less than 1 in 3, have access to affordable housing. DePaul University's Institute for Housing Studies found that in Chicago's Logan Square community, for example, there was a 12% drop in the share of available affordable housing between 2012 and 2014 and between 2015 and 2017. This enormous lack of affordable housing is driving some troubling trends. For example, some of the outcomes that this reality has produced, according to the Chicago Community Trust, is that Chicago lost about 100,000 African American residents in the past 10 years. Logan Square alone has lost over 20,000 Latino residents and nearly 10,000 African American residents in the past 15 years alone. How can increased investment in the National Housing Trust Fund help low-income communities stay in their homes?
Well, the National Housing Trust Fund program was designed exactly to meet the need that you're describing very well. And the need that you're describing exists in your district. It exists in every congressional district, whether they're rural, suburban, or urban. The primary cause of the affordable housing crisis we have today is the shortage of homes affordable and available to the lowest income people. So the National Housing Trust Fund program, at its current funding level, all of the dollars go to states in order for them to get the funds out to developers to build and preserve apartments for the lowest income people. So in your state, there's a project that's been funded through the first year's allocation of the Housing Trust Fund that's serving homeless veterans. In other communities across the country, Housing Trust Fund homes are housing people experiencing homelessness, previously experiencing homelessness, survivors of domestic violence, people who were previously chronically homeless, and others of some of the most vulnerable people in our country.
Thank you. Transit-oriented development. Chicago City Council 5 years ago passed an ordinance encouraging transit-oriented development. I believe in improving transportation and mobility for neighborhoods. That's a major reason why just last week I was in Logan Square to support a proposed 100-unit affordable housing development next to a transit station, the Chicago Transit Authority. However, we know that development, when done incorrectly in Chicago, can lead to gentrification, displacement, and racially inequitable outcomes. Since Chicago's council passed its transit-oriented development, several developments have gone up, but only one is currently available. How do we prioritize and provide resources for equitable transit-oriented development projects that will maintain diverse communities in the full sense of the word, like Logan Square?
Right, it's a great question, thank you. And so transit-oriented development is a really important part of the solution, ensuring that we have density in homes that have access to transportation, good jobs. And with that often comes increased investments in that community and gentrification. And what we have to ensure is that there's not displacement as a result of that gentrification. Affordable housing is the key to that. Affordable homes that are built and preserved in communities that are gentrifying become the anchor that allows for long-time residents, low-income residents, people of color, to remain and continue to afford their homes as costs go up around them. So it's essential to ensure in any kind of transit-oriented development project that there are affordable homes, affordable to the lowest income people, to allow those residents to remain.
Great. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield the rest of my 3 seconds.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today. I looked at the clock. It's been almost 3 hours, and we appreciate all of your testimony today. Mr. Carter, if I could, with you first, in your written testimony, you discussed the importance of the community development block grants and how that can address the shortage of affordable housing. We had a hearing 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we discussed in the hearing about withholding the CDBG funding to local communities to better incentivize and streamline the permitting process and other policies that create barriers to development projects. Now, I know you likely support increased funding for these CDBG projects, but do you believe that withholding these community development block grant funds from communities would better incentivize affordable housing and land use policies?
Yes, I think that there should be incentives to create a path of efficiency to make sure that we can get things done.
Thank you very much. If I could, Ms. Shandel, I'll start with you first, if you know. As it relates to the Community Development Block Grant Act of 1974, of course, it used census data in the funding formula. It's created, I think, anomalies within the dividing program's funding between the most needy and the least needy communities across the United States. What I'm talking about is Formula B, which, and you may or may not be familiar with it, allocates funding based on its share of growth lag. It's pre-1940 housing, and it's weighted at 50 times the appropriation. Some of the older suburbs benefit greatly from that pre-1940 data, even though they may have relatively low needs in their community. Are you familiar with the formula process, and if so, do you have an opinion about whether the formula itself needs to be updated?
I'm not familiar enough with that provision to speak specifically to that, but I would say generally that the CDBG formula would benefit from updating in order to assure that resources go to the communities that most need those resources.
Thank you, Ms. Yentel. Ms. Todman, are you familiar with the formula process, and if so, do you have an opinion about the way it's allocated?
I'm not familiar enough with it. I would say, though, as it relates to older suburbs, we should be very careful because there are a lot of lower income neighbors who are moving out of the urban core and into the suburbs and exurbs because that is where affordability sits. I think we need to be careful as we move that antenna to look at the historic movement of people in and out of the suburbs and the urban core.
Thank you, Ms. Todman. Mr. Lawson, are you familiar with the formula and about the pre-1940s way that it's calculated?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay. And you wouldn't have an opinion then?
No, sir.
Mr. Carter, are you familiar with it?
No, sir.
Okay. As it relates to my community, and I represent part of Memphis, Tennessee, there's been some questioning about the linkage between access to public transportation and to affordable housing. In my community, there have been some news reports lately about some of the commutes on public transportation can take up to 2 hours for the individuals to get from where they live to where they work. Ms. Yentel, do you have an opinion about what approaches this committee should consider or could consider that would better align efficiencies for housing needs and public transportation?
Well, I'd say transit-oriented development is a good way to achieve both. And the reason why people live so far from where they work is because they're not able to find homes that are affordable to them that are closer in. So it points back to this shortage of homes for the lowest income people and the importance of investing in constructing and preserving more homes that are affordable to them closer to where they work in all communities.
Thank you. Ms. Todman, in my remaining time, do you have any ideas about better aligning those needs?
Right. I do think, having practiced at the local level as a houser, I do think that there is a robust conversation that should always be had between the planning department, the housing agencies, and also the transportation. And to the extent the federal government can infuse that conversation with resources, I think they'll benefit from that.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I thank the witnesses for appearing as well. I am of the opinion, Madam Chair, that infrastructure starts with housing because all roads lead to some home, some community where people dwell. Housing is the necessity for people that creates the opportunity for contractors and engineers to build infrastructure. So let's not devalue the infrastructure of a home. And just for edification purposes, Mr. Carter, we have a bill, H.R. 123, that does exactly what you called to our attention. It's a pilot program, FHA, to allow rent, light bill, gas bill, water bill, phone bill, to be scored so that people who probably could afford a home, but for poor credit or thin credit, they'll be able to do so. I was very pleased that you brought this up. Would you just give an additional comment on how this can be beneficial, please?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that I do think in this country we have a bias of homeowners versus renters. And I don't believe that renters are often given the credit, both in terms of their community standing as well as how credit bureaus recognize their consistent payment of rent and utility bills. And to me, that's just one philosophical thing that I think that this country and certainly our organization believes that, you know, renters have, they're an important part of this nation.
Thank you. Quickly, let me ask this of all of you. Assuming that there's waste, fraud, and abuse, and there is. As a matter of fact, we have it in the military, but we always increase the budget. We don't decide that because there's waste, fraud, and abuse that we're not going to enhance the military budget. But can this problem that we are confronting, can it be solved without money? Do we have to have money to solve the problem? Is that a necessary ingredient?
Yes.
You need funding, yes.
Okay, let the record reflect that all agree. Moving on. Here is what we're confronting. Some of my colleagues believe that the poor can do more with less, but that the wealthy need more to do more. It has been my experience that the poor can benefit from more too, and that sometimes it's just the luck of the draw. You just weren't born in the right place, the right zip code as we're now prognosticating. You weren't born in the right family. You just didn't get the luck of the draw. And but for the grace of God, a president who had a tough time, had to pull himself up by a $1 million bootstrap. Some of us just don't get those kinds of bootstraps and have to contend with receiving, at the demise of our parents, a legacy of poverty. It's just the truth. So when I hear my colleagues talk about how they want to include more people in the social safety net, and they want to make sure that more people can be moved into various programs to help the homeless, but at the same time won't increase the funding. So what you're saying is more people, less money because you don't increase this funding, so you're expecting the people who are getting the benefits to do more with less. I find that quite intriguing, and I'm trying to be delicate with my verbiage. Sometimes my diction can be less than superb. But my final point is this. I think this $5 billion for the Housing Trust Fund is absolutely needed, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for placing it in there. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing today. I want to start by entering into the record this agreement, 31st day of January 2019, between HUD and the New York City Housing Authority in New York City.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you. And this is in follow-up to my colleague from New York earlier who cited some of those New York Times articles. So I just want to read this. So the complaint set forth the findings of the United States investigation alleging, among other things, that NYCA had routinely failed to comply with lead-based paint safety regulations, had failed to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing, including with respect to the provision of heat and elevators and the control and treatment of mold and pests, and had repeatedly misled HUD through false statements and deceptive practices. The next section. NYCA made admissions regarding, among other things, deficiencies in physical conditions with respect to lead, mold, heating, elevators, and pests, untrue statements to HUD regarding the condition of NYCA properties, and HUD then declared that NYCA is in substantial default. Ms. Yentel, were you aware of this specific agreement?
Yes.
You were, okay. Would you agree then, based on this, that I think it was suggested earlier that the federal government is solely responsible for this specific challenge? Would you agree that NYCA bears some responsibility, given that they in fact admitted to it themselves?
Well, much of what you read there is them admitting to deficiencies in conditions of units, broken elevators, broken boilers, lack of heating, which is the result of decades of lack of funding for NYCHA to support and redevelop those properties.
So, again, whereas based on NYCHA's misconduct as detailed in the complaint, the Secretary of HUD declared that NYCA is in substantial default. But moving on, so switching gears, I want to speak about a different type of regulation. Mr. Carter and Mr. Lawson, you spoke quite well about the importance, and I think we actually agree on this, that local and state regulations can have on the development of properties. It can hold you back, it can bring down supply artificially. So I want to speak about a different type of regulation, and those are the increases in regulation that have been proposed by the Green New Deal, which I believe would mandate net zero emissions for all buildings in the country. Mr. Lawson and Mr. Carter, you both cited today 32% of costs to development are due to regulations in multifamily units. Mr. Lawson, in your testimony, you said that when you do not build more affordable housing, it's for two reasons, primarily one, regulatory costs, and two, lack of federal subsidy. Speaking specifically about the regulatory cost, what do you think being forced to build at net zero emissions on all projects would do to those costs? Mr. Lawson.
I think it's unequivocal that the costs would go up because that technology is not in standard use today.
Significantly. Mr. Carter, do you feel the same way?
In general, yes. Although I think it's important to understand that when we acquire a property, we try to make it more energy efficient.
Right.
And we invest LED lighting and things like that. And one of the reasons is that it lowers our residents' monthly costs.
Right. And we all agree that we need to improve in that regard. I think everybody in this room. But this is something over and above that would add tremendous cost. And see, in my opinion, the reason why the Green New Deal is such a bad idea, and I really think it would be devastating to my community. I live in Northeast Ohio, Ohio's 16th district, proud to represent Northeast Ohio, and you guys just discussed it. The development costs would move to such an astronomical level that we wouldn't be able to build. We wouldn't be able to build affordable housing. And so the way that would hit my community, not just in affordable housing, but look at energy costs. We'd have families making real trade-offs between heating their homes and putting food on the table. That's the cost of these regulations. We need to talk about how do we remove barriers to development which we all know is important and everybody agrees on, not how can we add an additional layer that is unrealistic, that would price low-income families completely out of the housing market. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this important meeting, and to our witnesses, thank you for your testimony today. Let me first direct this question to Mr. Lawson and Ms. Carter. In my district of Charlotte, North Carolina, the city, the community development organizations, many of them in the private sector are working together to tackle our local housing crisis, and indeed it is a crisis for us in Charlotte. Private investment in affordable housing infrastructure is crucial, but do you agree that it's difficult for private developers to create affordable housing for the lowest income households without the benefit of federal housing subsidies?
Yes, I do. I agree.
I agree as well.
All right. Both of you, oh, okay. Can you speak to the importance of some of the key federal housing programs that help home builders create and preserve affordable housing?
Yes, the programs that help us create affordable housing are absolutely key. As I said in my testimony, affordable housing cannot be constructed without some form of subsidy.
All right.
The base subsidy is the low-income housing tax credit. Home funds are often used in conjunction with that. Project-based Section 8 and housing choice vouchers are also a component in many of our communities.
Okay. You agree?
Agreed.
Okay, let me ask all of you if you believe that housing is a human right. Just a yes or no.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Did everybody say yes?
Yes.
All right, we've got unanimous. Mr. Lawson, Ms. Todman, the Trump administration has proposed to zero out critical HUD and USDA housing programs such as the Community Development Block Grant Program. From the development perspective, why are these funds important to maintaining the current affordable housing stock and increasing the supply of affordable housing?
I would say for two reasons. One, home dollars, sometimes CDBG, are used as important gap financing tools in terms of writing down the cost of building a unit. I always say if a unit costs exactly what a unit will cost, whether it's for somebody who is middle income versus somebody who is low income. So it takes money on the front end or the back end, by the way of project-based vouchers, to actually write down that cost for a low income family. So it's important from that regard, but it's also important in preserving the housing that we have. And CDBG is used for that. Home is used for preservation tactics with private owners. So all of those programs are key for both of our keeping and preserving and building new housing.
You want to add something, Mr. Todman?
Yes.
Mr. Lawson, excuse me.
I would simply agree with that the home funds in particular in a lot of cases are the gap funding, the piece of funding that gets the property over the hump.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Todman, you represent a coalition that includes several public housing agencies. Can you describe the severe shortage of public housing and federal rental assistance that your members see in the communities that they serve?
Certainly. Many of the communities I serve, including, I might add, some of the smaller and rural agencies, are seeing increased demand on the resources that they have. There is evidence that for every 4 people that can actually qualify for affordable housing, there's only 1 family that actually can access it. And our members see that across the country, no matter what their geographic area may be. And that is not just in public housing, it's particularly in the voucher program, which is larger than the public housing program, and I'll say probably a little bit more popular because families have the opportunity to navigate. And there, the voucher program is entirely capped as well. There's not been any new net vouchers in some time. We're grateful for the mobility demonstration. And so certainly as the need grows in lower and middle income families, our housing agencies are trying to meet that need, but it's becoming harder every day.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for calling today's hearing to discuss what is a really critical issue. I want to focus in a little bit here as to how we lower the actual underlying cost of housing. I think as we look across the United States, we see a great diversity in the cost of housing. You look at San Francisco, the average rent is roughly $3,300, $3,200 in Los Angeles, approaching $3,000 in New York. Contrast that with Chicago, where the average rent is a little below $1,700, or in the city of Racine in southeast Wisconsin, around $1,400 a month. That's a pretty significant variation in housing. Mr. Carter, could you comment how cities like Chicago are keeping housing costs low compared to, say, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York?
That's a very, very good question. I would say one is if you look at specifically New York, and which we operate in New York and also in California, they are where you have the highest land costs, the highest entitlement costs, and you have some unique factors in California. You're dealing with seismic issues and things like that. And it's actually in Chicago, it tends to be, it's flat and it's easier, a little bit easier to build there. The other thing I think that when you're looking at construction costs, you know, one of the things that has gained more acceptance in a few other places are modular type, you know, factory-built components, which seems to happen a little bit more in the Midwest than the two coasts.
Is there a reason why you're seeing more modular homes in the Midwest versus on the coast? Is that a local regulation, or is that
I think it's a combination of two things. One, it's local regulation. I think secondly, there are more people who produce those components there in the Midwest. So transportation is a big part of you know, having to ship them.
And you commented earlier that you were saying there's higher entitlement costs in certain areas that are impacting the cost of housing. Can you comment on what you mean by that?
Well, the fact that when you look at to build a piece of land to build an apartment on in California, by the time it's maybe $150,000 just for the land, and maybe $50,000 of that would be entitlement costs. So,
Okay.
you know, and that price in the Midwest might be $25,000 to $50,000.
So going back now to kind of southeast Wisconsin, more of less of an urban area, how would you, what policies are you looking at that would ultimately lower the cost of housing to make it more affordable for people in those regions?
I believe the one thing is to make sure that number one is greater density, because if we can get to greater density, it reduces the cost per unit construction for development.
Thank you. And looking in particular at Avantha's average rents, is I look at it where it's, you know, roughly $3,200 is the average rent somewhere in the neighborhood in San Francisco, but you're providing rents in the neighborhood of $1,000, or average rents in Los Angeles approaching $2,000 a year, well below that in the neighborhood of $1,100. What are you doing in particular that's allowing you to keep those rent costs as low as you are?
We are generally buying things. Those are existing properties that we buy very, very well, and we try to do what we call smart renovations. We don't try, you know, we use synthetics as countertops, not marble. We resurface cabinets, we don't replace them, but we try to do smart renovations to keep our costs at a point where we can rent at those levels.
So it's market-based decisions that you're analyzing to determine how you're able to keep your costs under control.
Yes, and many times we buy things in communities that have been underserved by institutional capital, that we make the investment and we're able to buy perhaps a little cheaper than in more desirable locations.
And as you're looking at some of those renovations, how impactful is local codes that you're needing to meet in the reconstruction of those buildings as an impact on the ultimate price on rent after post-renovation?
It varies by locality.
Okay. Have you looked in particular at some of the building regulations that you would see in the Green New Deal and the impact that that would have on your ability to provide affordable rents?
I have not specifically looked at that.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take a moment to recognize a former member of Congress that's been with us today. Congresswoman Laura Richardson is in the audience. Thank you for the time you've spent in our committee today. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. So without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. So without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.